The people of Elk Ridge, Montana could not remember the last time Elijah Hawk had smiled. Some said it had been 3 years. Others said it had been longer than that the real Elijah had died the same winter night as his wife and baby daughter, and what walked among them now was just a ghost wearing a living man's skin. Old Ruth Gallagher, who ran the general store and knew everybody's business, whether they wanted her to or not, had once kept a quiet tally behind her counter. She marked a small X on her calendar every day that passed without seeing Elijah Hawk crack so much as a grin. She stopped counting at 1012, not because he smiled, because the counting itself had started to feel cruel, like measuring the depth of a well that had no bottom. Doc Martha Crane, who had known the Hawk boys since they were scrawny children, chasing each other through the meadow grass, put it differently. She said that Elijah did not just stop smiling. He stopped being present. His body still walked through town, still conducted business at the trading post, still nodded in greeting when addressed directly. But the man behind the eyes had checked out, gone somewhere cold and far away, somewhere that the living could not follow. He was 30 years old, but the lines carved around his eyes belonged to a man of 50, and his gaze carried the flat, distant quality of someone who had already decided that the best part of his life was behind him. Elk Ridge sat in a valley carved between two mountain ranges in the Montana Territory, accessible by a single road that became impassable for months during winter. It was not a gentle place. The town consisted of perhaps 40 buildings clinging to the valley floor like barnacles on a ship's hull. A general store, a trading post, a saloon, a small chapel, a schoolhouse, a livery stable, a sheriff's office, and scattered homes and businesses that existed because the people who built them were too stubborn or too desperate to build them anywhere else. The mountains rose on all sides, beautiful and merciless, their peaks lost in clouds of permanent snow. The people who lived here were tough, practical, and bound together by necessity because in Elk Ridge, cooperation was not a virtue. It was a survival strategy. The Hawk Ranch sat higher up the mountain than any other homestead, a sprawling property of several hundred acres, where three brothers raised cattle, broke horses, and in Elijah's case, crafted saddles and leather goods that had become renowned throughout the territory. Hawks Hollow, as the locals called it, occupied a natural shelf on the south face of the range where Elk Creek ran year-round and provided water for livestock and household alike. The main house was a two-story log structure built by Elijah's own hands using the notch and chink method, roofed with split pine shakes. There was a barn large enough for 12 horses, a cattle shelter, a tool shed, Elijah's leather workshop, and 3 smaller line cabins scattered across the upper pastures for use during roundup or emergency. Split rail fencing ran for miles along the property boundaries, miles of fence that the 3 brothers maintained every spring after the snow damage. The land was not kind. Winter stretched from October through April, sometimes May. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees below zero with regularity. Wind on the high ridges could knock a grown man off his feet. Wolves were a constant threat. The previous winter, a pack had taken 6 calves before Jonah, the youngest brother, tracked them to their den and convinced them to relocate by means that he declined to discuss in detail. Grizzlies came down the mountain in autumn. And the snow. Montana snow was not the gentle stuff that drifted in Christmas paintings. It was a white wall, thick and heavy, capable of burying houses and killing cattle by the dozen in a single night. The Hawk brothers were known throughout Elk Ridge for 3 things: their size, because all 3 stood well over 6.5 feet tall and were built like the mountains they lived on; their loyalty to each other, because picking a fight with one hawk meant fighting all 3; and the tragedy that had haunted their family for 3 years, the one that nobody talked about directly, but everybody understood the way frontier people understood blizzards and drought and the particular silence that settles over a house where someone has died. Elijah was the eldest at 30. He was the backbone of the ranch, the master craftsman, the one whose hands could shape a piece of raw leather into a saddle so fine that ranchers from 3 territories over placed orders months in advance. His workshop smelled of oil and tanned hide and wood smoke, and he spent more hours inside it than he did in his own home, because the work kept his mind occupied. The work kept the memories at bay. The work kept him from having to think about the empty rooms waiting for him each night, rooms he had built with love for a woman who would never walk through them again. He had married Sarah Mercer when he was 24, and she was 22. They had known each other since childhood. Sarah's family owned the neighboring ranch before her parents passed, and her brothers moved east, leaving Sarah alone on 600 acres of mountain land that she had neither the means nor the desire to work by herself. Elijah had loved her since he was 14 years old, though he would not have used that word at the time. He would have said he noticed her. He would have said she was hard to look away from. He would have said that when she laughed, the sound did something to his chest that he could not explain and did not particularly want to examine. They married in June when the wildflowers covered the mountain slopes in waves of purple and gold, and for 2 years their life was everything Elijah had dared to hope for and several things he had not. Sarah was everything he was not, warm where he was reserved, laughing where he was serious, social where he was solitary. She was the one who softened his edges, who convinced him that the world held beauty worth stopping for. She filled that house with curtains, she embroidered herself with flowers in every window, with the smell of bread baking and coffee brewing, and something indefinable that Elijah would later understand was simply the presence of someone who loved being alive. 2 years. That was all they had. The night Sarah went into labor, the worst blizzard of the winter of 1875 descended on the valley with the speed and fury of a living thing. Doc Martha Crane, who lived in town 3 miles down the mountain, could not reach the ranch. The roads were gone. The world was white noise and wind. Elijah was alone with his wife when the baby came wrong. Feet first, the cord tangled around the neck. He delivered his own daughter with hands that shook so badly he could barely grip the scissors to cut the cord while Sarah bled in a way that he knew with the gut-level certainty of a man who had butchered cattle and dressed wounds his whole life was not right. The baby girl lived for 4 hours, long enough for Sarah to hold her against her chest and whisper a name. Hope. She named her Hope with her last good breath, and then she closed her eyes and the color left her face like water draining from a basin, and Elijah sat there on the blood-soaked bed, holding his daughter and watching his wife die, and understanding with absolute clarity that the universe had just taken everything from him in a single night. He buried them together in the frozen ground on the ridge overlooking the ranch, the spot where Sarah used to sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the mountains. He dug the grave himself because the ground was too frozen for anyone else to help, and because he needed to do it with his own hands, the same hands that had built the house and delivered the baby and held Sarah as the light left her eyes. It took him 9 hours. When he finished, his hands were raw and bleeding, and he could no longer feel his feet, and something inside his chest had closed like a door slamming shut in a dark hallway. After the funeral, he went inside the house and systematically destroyed every piece of furniture in the main room. Chairs, table shelf, all of it reduced to kindling with his bare hands in a violence that frightened his brothers. Then the following week, he rebuilt every piece, because destroying them had not helped, because nothing helped, because the only thing left to do was work and keep working and never stop working, because the alternative was to sit still long enough for the memories to catch him. He carved Sarah's name into the central beam above the fireplace. Deep letters, precise, cut with the same tools he used for his finest leatherwork. Sarah. He did it because he was terrified that one day he would forget her face and he needed her name where he could see it every time he looked up, every morning and every night, a reminder that she had been real, that their life together had been real, that the happiness had not been something he invented in a fever dream. Then he stopped eating regular meals, stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time, stopped attending church, stopped going to town, socials, stopped accepting invitations from neighbors. He worked. That was all. From 3 in the morning until his body physically refused to continue, he worked, and the lines around his eyes deepened, and his clothes hung looser on his massive frame. And the people of Elk Ridge watched and worried and whispered among themselves, and nobody could figure out what to do about a man who was so clearly dying, but refused to admit he was even wounded. Nobody except his brother, Caleb. Caleb Hawk was 27, the middle of the 3 brothers, and the most sociable by a considerable margin. Where Elijah was a fortress, Caleb was a front porch. He ran the trading post in Elk Ridge, a cluttered, warm-smelling establishment where he bought and sold furs, dry goods, tools, ammunition, and anything else the frontier required. He was handsome in a slightly easier way than Elijah, with the same strong jaw and imposing height, but warmer eyes and a mouth that naturally curved toward a smile. Women in Elk Ridge considered him quite the prospect, but Caleb had shown no interest in settling down. His entire focus for the past 3 years had been singular and unwavering, saving his brother. He had tried everything. He invited Elijah to holiday dinners. Elijah ate in silence and left before dessert. He arranged encounters with eligible women at church functions. Elijah refused to attend. He suggested they visit Sarah's grave together so they could grieve as a family. Elijah told him in a voice that could freeze running water to mind his own business. He tried to anger compassion, humor directness, subtlety, patience. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close. And lately Caleb had noticed something that frightened him more than all the rest combined. Elijah was getting thinner. His shirts hung off his shoulders. His belt had been cinched 2 notches tighter since autumn. Doc Martha Crane had pulled Caleb aside after church one Sunday and told him with the blunt concern of a physician who had seen too many men waste away after losing their purpose, that she was worried about Elijah's health. Genuinely worried. The kind of worried that meant she was calculating how many months he had left if he kept on this way. Caleb was watching his brother die. Slowly, quietly, stubbornly, the way a man on the frontier dies when he has decided that living is no longer worth the effort. And Caleb could not bear it. That was the context in which Caleb made his decision. The narration does not excuse it. It understands it. 6 months before Clara Whitfield ever set foot in Montana, Caleb Hawk sat down at the desk in the back room of his trading post and answered a mail-order bride advertisement in a Boston newspaper. He wrote using Elijah's name, Elijah's address, and most crucially Elijah's story, or rather the story of who Elijah used to be. The letters he composed were masterpieces of hope and longing written in the voice of a man who still believed in the future. He wrote about the mountains, about the way the first light of dawn hit the peaks like God had spilled a bucket of gold across the scow. He wrote about the sound of Elk Creek in spring when the snowmelt turned it into a roaring silver ribbon. He wrote about wanting to build a life with someone who was not afraid of hard work and wild country, someone with courage enough to start fresh in a place where the land demanded everything and gave back beauty in return. He wrote about loneliness that went bone deep and a heart that still had room for the right person. He did not mention Sarah. He did not mention hope. He did not mention the grave on the ridge or the name carved above the fireplace or the fact that the man whose name appeared at the bottom of each letter had not smiled in over 1,000 days. And someone answered. The youngest Hawk brother Jonah knew nothing about any of this. At 24, Jonah was the wildest of the three, a gifted tracker and hunter who spent more time in the mountains than in town, and who communicated better with animals than with most human beings. He had a particular talent with horses and a dry-cutting wit that he deployed like a defensive weapon against anyone who tried to get too close. He rode into Hawks Hollow on that Tuesday morning in the deep winter of 1878. At a hard gallop, his horse lathered, despite the cold, a brace of rabbits slung over the saddle. He had been tracking in the high country for 3 days and was frozen hungry and in no mood for surprises. He found the ranch house cold and empty as usual. Elijah was in his workshop. Caleb was in town. Jonah built a fire and made coffee with the resigned efficiency of a man who had long ago accepted that domestic comfort was not a priority in this household. While the coffee brewed, he looked around the main room with the particular weariness that came from seeing a beautiful thing in decay. The house had been built with extraordinary care. Carved railings, built-in shelves, window seats positioned to catch the best light for reading or sewing, a wooden sign above the kitchen doorway that read, "Where Love Lives," in Sarah's careful script. But now the curtains were faded, the shelves dusty, the vase of dried flowers on the mantel, brittle and brown. Above the fireplace, carved deep into the central beam, the name Sarah watched over a room that had forgotten what warmth felt like. The house had been built for a family. Now it housed 3 men who moved through it like strangers in a hotel, eating cold meals at separate hours, sleeping in separate rooms, careful never to disturb the silence that had become the fourth and most demanding resident. Jonah had been 21 when Sarah died, old enough to understand the loss, but still young enough that grief did not sit right and shaded him like a coat made for a bigger man. Sarah had treated him like a younger brother, the only person besides Elijah who could make the quiet, suspicious youngest Hawk actually laugh. Her death had broken something in Jonah that he expressed not through withdrawal like Elijah, but through anger. Anger at the unfairness of the universe. At the cruel mathematics of a world where a woman that good could die at 24 with her baby in her arms. That anger had never fully cooled. It sat in his chest like banked coals ready to flare at the slightest provocation. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when everything changed. The sound of hooves on frozen ground reached him first, then voices, then Sheriff Harlan Tucker's unmistakable bark of authority cutting through the winter air. Jonah set down his cup and reached for the rifle by the door out of pure instinct. By the time he got to the porch, Tucker was already riding toward the workshop, and behind him, Caleb was galloping up the ranch trail from town with an expression that Jonah had never seen on his easygoing brother's face. It looked like guilt mixed with wild, desperate hope. Something was very wrong. In the saddle shop, Elijah was stitching a piece of leather when Tucker pushed through the door, bringing a blast of frigid air and an expression of profound bewilderment. "Elijah, we have got a situation," Tucker announced, stamping his boots on the wooden floor. The sheriff was 55, a Civil War veteran, whose right arm had been damaged at Gettysburg, and who carried the same Colt 1860 Army revolver he had used in the war. He was calm, fair-minded, and had seen enough liars in his life to spot one at 50 paces. Right now, he looked like a man who had just witnessed something that defied his considerable experience. "There is a young woman who just arrived on the morning stage from back east. She says she is your mail-order bride." The leather needle slipped from Elijah's fingers and clattered onto the workbench. "I did not send for any bride," Elijah said. His voice was flat. His amber eyes had narrowed to points. Tucker pulled a folded letter from his coat. "Well, according to the letter she is carrying, somebody using your name and address most certainly did. She has come all the way from Boston, Massachusetts, and she is standing out in the cold right now with 3 trunks and a bird in a cage." A bird in a cage. Elijah processed this detail with the stunned blankness of a man whose reality had just tilted on its axis. Then understanding crashed through him like ice water through a cracked dam. Not confusion. Recognition. Cold, terrible recognition. There was only one person in the world who would do this. Only one person who knew him well enough to forge convincing letters in his hand, who had been desperate enough to try anything, who loved him enough to commit this particular act of well-intentioned betrayal. Caleb, his younger brother, his interfering, scheming, absolutely infuriating younger brother, who had spent 3 years trying to drag Elijah back to the land of the living by every conventional means available, and who had apparently finally decided to try something unconventional. Elijah grabbed his heavy coat from the peg by the door and shoved his arms through the sleeves with more force than the garment deserved. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. He followed Tucker out into the bitter cold without a word. The main street of Elk Ridge was nearly deserted, the killing cold keeping every sensible person indoors. The stagecoach sat in front of Ruth Gallagher's general store, its horses stamping and snorting great clouds of steam into the frozen air. The driver was already unloading luggage with the hurried movements of a man who wanted to get his animals sheltered as quickly as possible. And there she stood. Clara Whitfield was the most spectacularly unprepared person for a Montana winter that Elk Ridge had ever seen, and Elk Ridge had seen its share of tenderfoots. She wore a traveling dress in pale blue, the kind of dress that might have been elegant in a Boston parlor, but that was actively suicidal in temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Her coat was thin wool suitable for a brisk autumn stroll along the Charles River, absolutely useless against the kind of cold that the Montana mountains produce between November and April. She was shivering so violently that Elijah could see it from 20 feet away, a whole-body tremor that made her look like a leaf caught in a gale. A ridiculous hat sat askew on her head, decorated with fabric flowers that had frozen into stiff, sad shapes, like a small garden that had died of shock. At her feet sat 3 large trunks scuffed from weeks of travel, and beside them inexplicably a bird cage draped with a cloth from which muffled but distinctly agitated sounds were emerging. Elijah approached. Clara turned toward him, and he got his first clear look at her face. She was young, 23, maybe 24, though the cold had stripped away whatever composure she might normally possess and left her looking younger still. She had a delicate heart-shaped face with high cheekbones and a small straight nose, and her eyes were enormous. Blue, the deep clear blue of a mountain lake in July, and they held more hope than any rational person should carry into a frozen Montana morning. Her lips were tinged blue from the cold. Her teeth chattered so hard the clicking was audible at 10 paces. Honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins in several places and hung in damp waves around her temples. But despite her obvious misery, despite the cold and the exhaustion, and the fact that she was clearly moments from either crying or fainting, or both, she straightened her spine. She lifted her chin. It was a small gesture, but Elijah noticed it the way a craftsman notices quality in raw material. That small lift of the chin spoke of something, breeding perhaps, or stubbornness, or the particular kind of courage that refuses to collapse, even when collapsing would be the reasonable thing to do. "Are you Mr. Elijah Hawk?" she asked. Her voice shook from cold and nerves, but the words were clear and properly formed, the accent unmistakably Eastern. Educated. She attempted what was clearly meant to be a graceful step toward him. But her frozen skirts had stiffened around her legs like pasteboard, and the thin sole of her completely inappropriate left boot caught on the stiff hem of her completely inappropriate dress. She stumbled, her arms pinwheeled. Her center of gravity shifted in a direction that no amount of good breeding could correct. And in a moment of spectacular, almost architecturally perfect clumsiness, Clara Whitfield pitched forward and fell directly into the frozen water trough that sat in front of Ruth Gallagher's general store. The impact was comprehensive. She hit the ice-covered surface of the trough with a yelp that startled the stagecoach horses into a simultaneous sideways lunge. Her hat flew off and landed in the street where a passing dog immediately seized it and trotted away with frozen flowers trailing from its mouth. The birdcage toppled sideways, and from beneath the cloth erupted a torrent of sounds that included in rapid succession frantic squawking, the violent flapping of wings against bars, and a string of profanity so colorful, so fluent, and so anatomically specific that two miners emerging from the saloon stopped dead in their tracks with their mouths hanging open. One of Clara's trunks, jarred loose from its stack by the collision, popped open and disgorged a cascade of ladies' undergarments across the frozen mud of Elk Ridge's main street. A pair of lace-trimmed drawers caught on a hitching post and hung there fluttering gently in the icy breeze, like a flag of surrender run up by a very small and very refined army. Clara lay sprawled across the ice trough, her skirts hiked up to reveal sensible boots and several layers of petticoats, her hair cascading everywhere, her face a shade of crimson that had nothing whatsoever to do with the temperature. She was the picture of absolute, total, irredeemable mortification. Elijah stared. Tucker stared. Ruth Gallagher, who had pressed her face against the window of her store, stared. The two miners stared. A woman crossing the street with a basket of eggs stared. For a long, frozen, utterly silent moment, the entire visible population of Elk Ridge, Montana territory held its collective breath. And then something happened that had not happened in 3 years. It started in Elijah's chest. A pressure. An unfamiliar sensation like a muscle being used after years of disuse. It moved upward through his throat, gaining force and momentum, and before he could stop it, before he could even identify what it was, a sound burst from his mouth that he did not recognize. It was a laugh, not a small chuckle, not a polite social noise. A real, genuine, full-bodied laugh that erupted from somewhere deep in his belly and rolled through him like a wave, shaking his massive shoulders, creasing his weathered face, transforming his features so completely that for a moment he looked like a different person entirely. A younger person. A person who had not spent 3 years studying the inside of a coffin with his heart. Tucker's jaw dropped. Ruth Gallagher gripped the windowsill with both hands. The two miners exchanged a glance of pure, slack-jawed astonishment. Caleb, who had just arrived on horseback and was dismounting in front of the trading post, froze with one foot in the stirrup and one on the ground, his face cycling through approximately 17 emotions in 3 seconds. Elijah Hawk was laughing. For the first time in 1,096 days, give or take. Ruth would check her calendar later and confirm the exact number, and she would tell the story for years afterward, refining it each time because some moments are too important to let the details get fuzzy. Clara, from her position on the ice trough, turned an even more vibrant shade of red. She looked up at the enormous laughing mountain man and said with every scrap of dignity, woman sprawled across a frozen water trough, with her undergarments decorating the main street, could possibly muster, "This is not how I imagined our first meeting." That made Elijah laugh harder. He sobered quickly, though, as reality reasserted itself with its customary brutality. The laugh died and the old weight settled back onto his features, but his face felt strange, stretched. like a mask that had cracked and could not quite fit properly anymore. He stepped forward and offered his hand. "Miss, there has been a terrible mistake." She grasped his hand with frozen fingers so cold that even through his calloused skin he could feel them burning. He pulled her upright with no effort at all. Standing, she barely reached his shoulder. She was tiny, fine-boned, the kind of small that made his hands look like they belonged to a different species. Up close, he could see that her blue eyes were starting to shimmer, that the hope in them was curdling into something far more painful as the weight of his words landed. "A mistake," she said, barely a whisper. "I did not send for a mail-order bride," Elijah said as gently as his rough voice could manage, which was not especially gentle. "I believe my brother Caleb may have done this without my knowledge or my consent. I am very sorry you have come all this way, but I cannot marry you." The tears came then. They tracked down her frozen cheeks and caught the light like tiny prisms. She pulled her hand from his and wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-comfort so instinctive and so solitary that something twisted in Elijah's chest. He refused to acknowledge it. He pushed it aside the way he had been pushing things aside for 3 years. "I see," Clara said. "Of course, I should have known it was too good to be true. The letters were so kind, so thoughtful. I suppose I was foolish to believe that someone actually wanted me." Those last 4 words, "someone actually wanted me." They hit Elijah like a fist he had not seen coming. He set his jaw against the impact and offered to pay for her return trip to Boston. Clara shook her head slowly. "I cannot go back to Boston. There is nothing for me there anymore." She told her story with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had recited her misfortunes enough times that the edges had worn smooth. She was a governess. Had been a governess for 5 years, employed by a wealthy family called the Caldwells. The master of the house had made advances. She had refused them. His wife had found out and blamed Clara instead of her husband. Clara was dismissed without a reference and blacklisted throughout Boston society. She had used the last of her savings for the journey west. She had $7.32 to her name. No family, no prospects, and a parrot with a vocabulary that would scandalize a bishop. As if on cue, the parrot chose this precise moment to shriek from beneath the overturned cage cloth, "Damn your eyes." The words rang across the silent street with the clarity of a church bell. Several people flinched. The minister's wife, who had been watching from the chapel steps, clutched her collar. "She picked that up from the sailors on the ship," Clara said, her voice mixing apology with exhaustion. "I am working on correcting it." "Right," Elijah said. "I can see you are making excellent progress." It was not much, a dry observation barely qualifying as humor. But Clara's mouth twitched just slightly, and Elijah found himself momentarily unsettled by the fact that he had instinctively tried to make her feel better. He did not do that. He had not done that for anyone in 3 years. The practical problem was immediate and urgent. Clara could not remain outside. The temperature was dropping, and Doc Crane, who arrived after hearing the commotion, took one look at Clara's blue-tinged skin and stated with the professional flatness that this woman needed to be indoors, warm and fed within the hour, or they would be dealing with severe frostbite at minimum and something considerably worse at maximum. The boarding house was full-packed with railroad surveyors. Caleb's trading post had no living quarters. Tucker suggested Hawks Hollow, which had multiple spare rooms. "Absolutely not," Elijah said immediately. "3 unmarried men and a young woman under the same roof. That is completely inappropriate." "More inappropriate than her freezing to death on Main Street?" Tucker asked. Doc Crane settled it. "She said she would check on Clara daily. She said that propriety was a luxury and survival was not. She said that anyone who had a problem with the arrangement could take it up with her, and she fixed the assembled townspeople with a look that made it extremely clear what would happen to anyone foolish enough to accept that invitation." Nobody in Elk Ridge argued with Doc Martha Crane. Not twice anyway. Elijah heard himself agree. The words came out of his mouth before the rest of him had fully consented. "She can stay in the spare room, temporarily, until this cold breaks and we can figure out a proper arrangement." "Thank you, Mr. Hawk," Clara said. Her enormous blue eyes were brimming with gratitude and relief, and the particular vulnerability of someone who has just been pulled back from an edge they did not want to look over. "I promise I will not be any trouble at all." Even as the words left her mouth, she stepped backward and collided squarely with the bird cage. The cage slid across the ice. The cloth cover flew off completely, revealing the bird for the first time, a magnificent green parrot with a bright red head and bright black eyes that radiated the specific, focused fury of a creature that had been knocked over one too many times today. Penelope opened her beak and unleashed every obscenity in her considerable vocabulary at maximum volume. The words echoed off the buildings of Elk Ridge like artillery fire. A passing child stopped and listened with the fascinated concentration of a student encountering a new and thrilling curriculum. Clara scooped up the cage, murmuring frantic apologies to the bird, to Elijah, to the minister's wife, to the child's horrified mother, and to the general population of Elk Ridge, Montana territory. "She is usually much better behaved," Clara said desperately. "The cold agitates her. I am so very sorry. Penelope, that is not appropriate language." "Kiss my stern," Penelope shrieked helpfully. Elijah closed his eyes. He drew a long, slow breath through his nose. Then he gathered Clara's 3 trunks, lifting all of them with the ease of a man who had been hauling saddles and fence posts since he was 12 years old, and started walking toward the edge of town. "My house is this way," he said without turning around. "Can you manage the bird?" Clara hurried after him, clutching the cage, her frozen skirts making every step a negotiation. She slipped on the ice twice in the first 50 yards. The first time she caught herself on a fence post. The second time she caught herself on a horse tied to a hitching rail. The horse snorted and gave her a look of deep personal offense. Behind them, Tucker shook his head and said to Ruth Gallagher, who had ventured outside to watch the procession, "Well, that is either going to be the best thing that ever happened to that man or the worst." Ruth, who had already mentally reset her calendar counter to 0, replied, "He laughed, Harlan. He actually laughed. I will take those odds any day." The ranch house was cold when they arrived. Elijah kicked open the front door and deposited the trunks in the entryway. His breath fogged in the dim interior. Clara followed him inside, still shivering violently, and set Penelope's cage on a small table near the window. Then she stopped moving. She stood perfectly still in the middle of the main room, and Elijah watched her eyes travel across the space with an attention to detail that surprised him. She was seeing the house the way he could no longer see it. She was seeing what it had been built to be. The carved mantelpiece, the wide planked floors sanded smooth enough to walk barefoot, the kitchen designed at a woman's height rather than a man's, the window seats positioned to catch the best morning light for reading or sewing. The embroidered curtains faded now, the colors washed out by 3 years of sun and neglect, the dried flowers on the shelf petals brown and brittle, the wooden sign above the kitchen doorway, "Where Love Lives," and above the fireplace carved deep into the central beam in precise, deliberate letters, Zoira. Clara's eyes found the name. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She did not ask about it. Something passed across her face that Elijah could not immediately identify. Not jealousy, not discomfort, something quieter than that, something that looked, if he was reading her correctly, like recognition. The recognition of someone who understood what it meant to carry the dead with you. She said nothing about it. She simply turned to face him and waited. Elijah built up the fire, coaxing the flames to life with the efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He set water to boil for tea. The domestic sounds felt foreign after so long, the kettle's whistle, the crackle of new wood catching the small noises of another person moving through rooms that had been silent for 3 years. "There are blankets in the chest upstairs," he said. "Spare room is the second door on the right. Get out of those wet clothes and wrap yourself in something warm. We can talk, Dart. You are no longer in danger of losing your fingers." She nodded and made her way carefully up the stairs, leaving small puddles from her frozen skirts on each step. Elijah watched her go. Then he stood alone in his kitchen, listening to the water boil, and tried to identify the strange, unsettling sensation that was sitting in his chest like a stone he had swallowed without noticing. 20 minutes later, Clara reappeared at the bottom of the stairs, wrapped in what appeared to be every quilt she could find, her honey blonde hair hanging loose around her shoulders as it dried. Her face had regained some colors, though her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. She had been crying upstairs. They sat by the fire. Elijah gave her tea, and she wrapped her frozen fingers around the cup and held it like a lifeline. Silence settled over them. the awkward, prickly silence of two strangers forced into proximity by circumstances neither had chosen. Clara spoke first. The letters I received were so detailed. They talked about life in Montana, about the mountains and the horses, about wanting to start fresh, but not wanting to do it alone. I memorized passages. They gave me hope when I had none left. My brother wrote those letters, Elijah said. Yes, but he wrote them about you, about who you are, about who I was. She looked at him, and the intelligence in those blue eyes was sharper than he expected. Perhaps. He told her then, staring into the fire rather than at her, because it was easier to say these words to the flames than to a living face. My wife and daughter died 3 years ago. Sarah died in childbirth. The baby only lived a few hours. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like it happened to someone else entirely. My brother thinks I need to move on. He does not understand that I am not interested in replacing what I lost. That is why you have not smiled in so long, Clara said. Not a question. Elijah looked at her. How would you know anything about that? When you laughed earlier, the sheriff looked like he had seen a ghost rise from the grave. Several people on the street actually stopped walking and stared. It was quite clear that seeing you laugh was not a common occurrence. I have not had much cause for laughter. I imagine not. Clara sipped her tea. Then she added with a faint, self-deprecating smile that looked like it cost her something. Though I suppose it is rather ironic that my complete and total humiliation was the thing that finally broke your streak. I assure you, falling into frozen water troughs is not a regular habit of mine. Falling over other things, perhaps, but not usually water troughs. Despite everything, despite the anger and the grief and the fundamental wrongness of this entire situation, Elijah felt his lips move. Not a smile, not quite, but something close. Closer than anything had gotten in 3 years. You admit to being clumsy then, he said. Oh, terribly. My mother used to say I could trip over my own shadow on a clear day. In my last employer's home, I managed to knock over 3 porcelain vases, a grandfather clock, and a suit of decorative armor, though in my defense, the armor was already structurally unsound. That is quite a record. I do try, Clara said, and her smile strengthened just a little. That evening, after ensuring Clara was settled with food and blankets and a fire that would last through the night, Elijah pulled on his coat and walked through the frozen darkness toward Elk Ridge. His fury at Caleb had not dimmed. If anything, the hours of proximity to Clara, hours of witnessing firsthand the human consequences of his brother's scheming, had sharpened his anger to a fine, bright edge. He found Caleb closing up the trading post. The guilty expression on his brother's face when he saw Elijah confirmed everything that did not need confirming. Before you say anything, Caleb began, raising his hands. Elijah grabbed him by the coat front and slammed him against the wall hard enough to rattle every bottle and jar on the shelves. A tin of coffee fell and burst open on the floor. You had no right, Elijah said. His voice was low and tight, the kind of quiet that was more frightening than shouting. No right at all, Caleb. You are killing yourself. Caleb did not struggle against his brother's grip. He did not try to break free or defend himself. Instead, he met Elijah's eyes and let his own fill with tears, and his voice broke wide open like a dam giving way. You spend every waking hour working until your hands bleed. You do not eat. You do not sleep. You do not speak to anyone unless they speak to you first. It has been 3 years, Elijah, 3 years, and you are thinner now than you were last winter. Doc Crane told me she is worried about you. Not worried the way friends worry. Worried the way a physician worries about a patient she might lose. Caleb's voice cracked fully and the tears fell. You are my brother. You are the person who raised me after Pa died. You taught me to ride and shoot and work leather and build fences. You are the strongest man I have ever known, and I am watching you disappear right in front of me. Inch by inch, day by day, you are fading out. And I cannot. I will not. He swallowed hard. I love you too much to stand by and watch you die without putting up a fight, Elijah. Even if you hate me for it. The raw emotion in Caleb's voice pierced through Elijah's fury, the way no argument or logic ever could. He released his brother and stepped back. His hands were shaking. Not from anger, from something he did not want to name. So you arranged a marriage, Elijah said, his voice rough. You forged letters. You made promises in my name to a woman who crossed an entire country for nothing. I hope that once she got here, once you met her, you might see that life could still hold something worth wanting. I know it was wrong. I know I overstepped. But I was desperate. I missed my brother. Not this ghost. My real brother. They stood there in the ruined silence of the trading post, two men who loved each other and had no idea how to fix what was broken between them. Coffee grounds covered the floor. The cold crept in through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the Montana wind howled like something grieving. She needs a place to stay until she can find work, Elijah said finally. That is all this is. She is stranded here because of what you did, and the least I can do is make sure she does not freeze or starve. Of course, Caleb agreed quickly, and Elijah could see the small, desperate spark of hope that flickered to life in his brother's eyes. It made him want to break something. Do not read anything more into this, Elijah warned. I am not looking for a wife. I am not looking to move on. I am helping someone in need because it is the right thing to do. I understand completely, Caleb said, but the spark in his eyes did not go out. Elijah left before he could say something that would make things worse. He walked back through the frozen darkness toward his ranch, toward a house that now contained a stranger, a cursing parrot, and the faint persistent scent of lavender soap that had somehow already begun to change the smell of the air, inside rooms that had smelled only of dust and leather and loneliness for 3 years. When he arrived, the house was warm. Someone had banked the fire correctly, which surprised him because that was not a skill most city women possessed. The kitchen lamp was lit, casting a pool of soft gold across the table. And there at the bottom of the stairs, he found Jonah. His youngest brother was standing with his arms crossed and his green hazel eyes narrowed to slits, staring at the doorway to the spare room as if he could burn a hole through it with the force of his disapproval. Who the hell is she? Jonah said, turning that flat, hostile stare on Elijah. And why is she in Sarah's house? Sarah's house. The words landed like a blade. Clara, who had apparently come to the top of the stairs at the sound of voices, went pale. Elijah felt his jaw tighten until the bones ached. Caleb, who had followed Elijah back to the ranch to ensure nothing went catastrophically wrong, stepped through the front door just in time to catch the full force of Jonah's fury. She is here because of me, Caleb said, and he told Jonah the truth. Jonah's reaction moved through stages like weather across a mountain. Disbelief, cold fury at Caleb, suspicion of Clara, and finally a simmering frost-edged resentment that he directed at everyone in the room equally the way a cornered animal bares its teeth at the whole world. He turned to Clara, who was standing at the top of the stairs wrapped in quilts, clutching the banister, looking very small and very alone. How long are you staying? Only until I can find work and afford my own lodging, Clara said. Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not step back. That small act of courage, meeting the hostile eyes of a man twice her size without flinching, registered in the room like a sound nobody expected to hear. I have no intention of imposing on anyone, Jonah grunted, turned, walked upstairs. His bedroom door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. From the table by the window, Penelope responded to the slam with impeccable timing. Abandon ship. She really does have remarkable instincts for the dramatic, Caleb observed. Nobody laughed, but the tension cracked just enough to let everyone breathe. That first night at Hawks Hollow was a masterwork of discomfort. 4 people under one roof, none of them at ease. Elijah in his room, lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing on the other side of the wall. Clara in the spare room, surrounded by a dead woman's home, trying to sleep and failing. Caleb in his old room, racked with guilt and hope in equal measure, staring at his hands and wondering if what he had done was salvation or sabotage. And Jonah rigid in his bed, jaw clenched, thinking about Sarah and wanting this stranger gone. But the story does not end on that discomfort. It ends on something else. 2 small moments, quiet as snowfall, that planted seeds for everything that was to come. The first moment. Sometime after midnight, Clara crept downstairs in the dark. She could not sleep, and she was worried about Penelope. The fire had burned low, and the main room had grown cold. She found the bird cage on the table, the parrot shivering beneath her cloth cover. Clara unwrapped one of her own quilts and draped it carefully around the cage, tucking the edges to hold in warmth. As she adjusted the covering, her eyes traveled upward to the beam above the fireplace. The carved letters were visible even in the faint glow of the dying embers. Sarah. Clara reached up. Her fingertips traced each letter slowly, gently, the way a person touches something sacred. I am sorry, she whispered into the empty room. Her voice was barely audible, thin as silk thread in the dark. I am sorry he lost you. I am sorry you did not get to watch your daughter grow up. I promise I will not try to take your place. I just need somewhere safe for a little while. The second moment, from the darkness of the hallway above, unseen, unheard, Elijah Hawk stood watching. He had come downstairs because he heard movement. 3 years of solitary vigilance had made him a light sleeper, attuned to every creak and whisper of the house he had built, and the soft pad of unfamiliar footsteps on his stairs had pulled him from his restless half-sleep like a hand on his shoulder. He stood in the shadows at the top of the staircase, looking down at this stranger, this small, clumsy, shivering woman from Boston who had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of letters she believed were real, who had fallen into a water trough in front of the entire town, who had a parrot that could swear in 3 languages and a spine made of something that did not bend easily, and who was now standing in the dark speaking to his dead wife's name with a tenderness and respect that closed his throat so tightly he could not draw breath. He retreated silently to his room. He lay on his bed in the darkness and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes hard until colors bloomed behind his lids, and he tried to understand what was happening to him. Because something small and unfamiliar and terrifying was stirring in the frozen wasteland of his chest, pushing up through 3 years of compacted grief, like a green shoot through late spring snow. He did not know what it was yet, but somewhere in Elk Ridge, Ruth Gallagher had reset her calendar to day 1. And somewhere in the spare room down the hall, a woman who had lost everything was sleeping under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and leather, and a life she had not been part of, dreaming of letters that had promised her a home. And in the darkness between them, in the silence of a house built for love and inhabited by grief, something had begun. Something that neither of them had asked for, and neither of them was ready for, and neither of them could stop. Not even if they wanted to. The days that followed Clara Whitfield's arrival at Hawks Hollow had the fragile, uncertain quality of river ice in early March. You could not see the changes happening. You could not point to a single crack and say, there, that is where it started. But you could hear it if you listened. Small sounds, shifts in pressure, the quiet groaning of something that had been frozen solid for a very long time, beginning against its will to give. The cold spell held. The single road out of the valley lay buried under snowdrifts taller than a man on horseback. The nearest town with regular eastbound stage service was 3 hard days south, and the route was impassable. Clara Whitfield was stranded at Hawks Hollow whether anyone liked it or not, and of the 4 people sharing that roof, the count of those who liked it varied by the hour. They established a routine the way people do when circumstances force proximity, and politeness is the only alternative to violence. Elijah rose before dawn and disappeared into his saddle shop, emerging only when hunger or necessity dragged him out. Caleb rode into Elk Ridge each morning to manage his trading post, returning each evening with supplies and an expression of hopeful guilt that made Elijah's fist clench involuntarily every time he saw it. Jonah vanished into the mountains for days at a stretch, checking trap lines and scouting for the wolf pack that had been circling the upper pasture, and also not coincidentally avoiding the house and the woman in it. Clara, left alone for most of each day, did what she had done her entire life when the ground shifted beneath her feet. She made herself useful. She started with the kitchen because the kitchen was the heart of a house, and this heart had stopped beating. She scrubbed surfaces that had not been scrubbed in years. She organized the pantry, which contained enough salt pork and dried beans to survive a siege, but nothing resembling a balanced meal. She figured out the temperamental wood stove through a process of trial and error that involved burning her first 3 attempts at biscuits into objects that Penelope refused to eat, and Penelope would eat almost anything. But Clara did not stop trying. She adjusted the dampers, learned the stove's hot spots, experimented with timing, and by the 4th morning she produced a batch of biscuits that were golden on top, soft inside, and filled the kitchen with a smell that had not existed in that house since Sarah Hawk died. She set them on the table with butter and honey at midday, the way a governess sets out a lesson. Then she went upstairs to mend a curtain and waited. Elijah came in from the workshop at noon as he always did, intending to eat cold salt pork standing up at the counter, and returned to work within 5 minutes. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The biscuits sat on the table still faintly steaming, golden and symmetrical, on a clean plate. The butter was in a dish. The honey was in a garnish with a spoon. There was a cup of coffee still hot, positioned at the head of the table where a man would sit. Elijah stood in that doorway for a full 10 seconds, staring at the plate of biscuits, and the expression on his face was one that nobody was present to witness, which was probably for the best because it was the expression of a man who had just been punched in a place he had forgotten he had. 3 years of cold meals eaten standing up. 3 years of coffee made in the dark and consumed without tasting it. 3 years of treating food as fuel and nothing more. And here were biscuits. Hot biscuits made with care, set on a clean table in a warm kitchen by someone who had thought about what he might want before he knew he wanted it. He ate 3. He did not say thank you. But from that day forward, he came to the kitchen at noon, every day, without fail. It was the first routine he had changed in 3 years. Clara expanded her campaign beyond the kitchen with the steady, patient determination of water wearing down stone. She washed the faded curtains and rehung them. She removed the dead flowers from the vase on the mantel and replaced them with pine boughs that filled the room with a sharp, clean scent. She swept floors, beat rugs, polished the window glass until light poured in clear and strong for the first time in years. She mended clothes from a neglected basket, darning socks with tiny, precise stitches that spoke of professional training. She did not touch Sarah's things. She did not rearrange the carved sign above the kitchen door. She did not ask about the name on the beam above the fireplace. She worked around the grief like a river works around a boulder, flowing past it without pretending it was not there. The house began to change, not in its bones, in its breath. It started to smell like a place where someone lived rather than a place where someone was waiting to die. When the weather eased enough for Clara to venture into town, she walked the 3 miles to Elk Ridge in the new winter clothes that Elijah had grudgingly purchased for her at Ruth Gallagher's store. Proper wool dress, heavy stockings, fur-lined coat boots that would actually keep her feet attached to her body in Montana temperatures. He had called it practicality, not kindness. She had called it more generosity than she deserved. He had said nothing and walked away, and Clara had noticed that his ears turned red when he was uncomfortable with being thanked, which was a detail she filed away without comment. Ruth Gallagher hired her within 10 minutes of their first real conversation. Ruth needed help with inventory and customers, particularly as spring approached and traffic increased. The pay was modest, but it was honest, and Clara accepted it with a gratitude that made Ruth pat her hand and say, "You will do fine, dear. This town needs more women with backbone." Agnes Patterson, the school teacher, interviewed Clara about her educational background and was impressed enough to offer 3 afternoons a week helping with the younger students. Clara had found work, real work. For the first time since Boston, she had a foothold. Her clumsiness, however, traveled with her like a devoted and deeply unhelpful companion. On her first day at the general store, she turned too quickly in the narrow aisle, and her elbow caught the edge of a carefully stacked pyramid of canned goods. The pyramid collapsed with a sound like a tin avalanche. Cans of peaches, beans, tomatoes, and condensed milk rolled in every direction under shelves behind counters and out the front door into the street where a passing mule stepped on one and spooked sideways into a water barrel. Ruth stood behind the counter and watched the catastrophe unfold with the calm of a woman who had survived worse. At the schoolhouse, Clara tripped on the front steps and slid 3 feet on her backside in full view of a dozen children who responded with the uninhibited delight that only children and the truly heartless can produce in the face of adult humiliation. She got her skirt caught in the trading post door and had to be extracted by Caleb, who laughed so hard he had to sit down on a flour barrel and wipe his eyes with his sleeve. But people noticed something else about Clara Whitfield, something that outweighed the clumsiness by a considerable margin. She was kind. Not performatively kind, not kind in the strategic way of a person trying to make allies. Kind in the deep, automatic, unthinking way of someone for whom caring about other people was not a choice but a reflex. She remembered names after a single introduction. She asked about children, about livestock, about the small worries that made up the texture of frontier life. She helped an elderly widow carry packages without being asked. She read stories to the school children with such animation that even the most restless boys sat still and listened with their mouths open. Elk Ridge, which had regarded her with initial curiosity and mild scandal, began to warm. Each of the Hawk brothers traveled a different road in their relationship with Clara, and the distances they covered said as much about them as it did about her. Caleb was the easiest. He and Clara shared a natural warmth, a facility with conversation, a tendency toward humor as a coping mechanism. They became friends quickly, the kind of friends who could talk about difficult things without either person shutting down. Caleb told Clara stories about who Elijah used to be, about the man who built that house with his own hands for a woman he loved, about the laughter that used to fill those rooms. "He is still in there," Caleb told her one afternoon at the trading post, while Clara helped him sort a shipment of dry goods. "I know he is. I see it sometimes just for a second, and then it is gone." Jonah was a different matter entirely. For 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, the youngest Hawk brother communicated with her primarily through silence, hostile glances, and the occasional grunt that could have meant anything from "pass the salt" to "I wish you would fall into another water trough, preferably a deeper one." He referred to her exclusively as the Boston problem when speaking to his brothers, and he left any room she entered with the deliberate pointed timing of a man making a statement. The change came on a cold Tuesday afternoon, without warning or preamble. Jonah rode back from the high country and went directly to the barn to unsaddle his horse. When he pushed open the barn door, he stopped moving. He stopped breathing. His hand went to the knife on his belt out of pure instinct, because what he was seeing could not possibly be happening, and therefore must be some kind of trap. Clara Whitfield was standing on a stool beside Riot. Riot was Jonah's horse, a massive coal-black stallion with a temper that had earned him his name and a reputation that extended across 3 counties. Riot had bitten 4 ranch hands, kicked through 2 fence posts, dragged a farrier the full length of the corral, and once attempted to stomp a mountain lion that made the mistake of wandering too close to his paddock. He tolerated exactly one human being on the face of the earth, and that human being is Jonah Hawk, who had raised him from a colt and who understood him in the wordless, intuitive way that certain men understand certain horses. And Riot was standing perfectly still. His ears were forward, his eyes were half closed, his great black head was lowered, and Clara was brushing his mane with slow, gentle strokes while talking to him in a low, sweet voice about her day, about the children at the school, about the biscuits she had burned that morning, about how she missed Boston sometimes, but not as much as she expected, about how the mountains were beautiful in a way that frightened her a little because beauty that large made a person feel very small. Riot, the horse who had once bitten a blacksmith hard enough to draw blood, was standing like a lamb. Jonah watched for a long moment. Then he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, "He does not let anyone touch him." Clara startled. Her foot slipped on the stool. She grabbed Riot's mane to steady herself, and the horse did not so much as twitch. "He seemed lonely," she said simply, looking at Jonah with those clear blue eyes, like he just wanted someone to talk to him. Something shifted in Jonah's face. It was not a dramatic change. It was not a softening so much as a fracture. A single crack in the stone wall he had built between himself and this woman, and through that crack Clara glimpsed something she recognized immediately. Loneliness. The same loneliness she saw in Elijah, but younger, rawer, angrier. The loneliness of a man who had lost someone who mattered and decided that the safest response was to stop letting anyone matter again. "You are going to fall off that stool and get yourself killed," Jonah said. He walked away. He did not slam the barn door. And the next morning, Clara found a small carved wooden bird on the kitchen table. It was exquisite, delicate, detailed, the feathers rendered with a precision that spoke of real talent and real patience. When Clara picked it up and turned it in the light, she saw that it was a hawk. She asked Caleb about it. Caleb smiled and said nothing. 2 days later, she found a second carving. A horse, then a third, a rabbit, then a small wooden wildflower that was so finely made she could see the individual petals. Jonah never acknowledged the carvings. He never mentioned them, but they kept appearing, and Clara kept finding them, and she placed each one on the windowsill in her room where the morning light could catch them. The distance between the Boston problem and something else was closing one small wooden animal at a time. Elijah's arc was the most complicated and the most resisted. He maintained strict emotional distance with the discipline of a man who had been practicing isolation the way other men practice marksmanship. He was polite, he was correct. He was devastating in his coldness, not because he was cruel, but because the absence of warmth from a man so clearly capable of it was its own particular kind of wound. But the cracks kept forming. He came home one evening to find Clara standing on a chair in the main room, stretching to reach something on the high shelf above the bookcase. He opened his mouth to call a warning. Too late. The chair wobbled. Clara's balance shifted. She yelped a short, sharp sound of surprise and fell backward. Elijah moved on pure instinct. 3 strides across the room, faster than a man his size should have been able to move, and his arms closed around her waist as she fell against his chest. The momentum carried them both a half-step backward, but he held steady, absorbing her weight as if she were made of paper. For a moment, neither of them moved. Elijah could feel the warmth of her body through the layers of wool and cotton. The scent of her hair reached him, lavender from the soap she had been using, faint but unmistakable. She was alive in his arms in a way that made something in his chest clench with a pain that was not grief. It was different from grief. It was the ache of a nerve waking up after years of numbness, the excruciating sensation of feeling returning to a limb that had been dead so long he had forgotten it existed. Clara looked up at him. Her face was inches from his. Her blue eyes were wide and startled, her lips slightly parted, and he could see the pulse beating fast in the hollow of her throat. For one charged, electric, absolutely terrifying moment, the air between them changed. It thickened. It heated. It became something that had nothing to do with gratitude or obligation or circumstance, and everything to do with the fact that he was holding a woman in his arms, and she was looking at him as if she could see something behind his eyes that he had been trying very hard to keep hidden. Then Elijah set her on her feet and stepped back as if the contact had burned him. "You need to be more careful," he said. His voice came out rough, almost harsh. "You could have seriously hurt yourself." He spent the rest of the evening in his workshop working leather with a force that was going to ruin the piece if he did not ease up, and he did not ease up because the alternative was sitting still and thinking about the weight of Clara Whitfield in his arms and the way her hair smelled and the look in her eyes when she gazed up at him, and those were thoughts he could not afford. Those were thoughts that led to places he had sworn he would never go again. That night, in the dark of his room, he lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and failed completely to stop thinking about her. Clara carried a secret with her, and it lived in a small velvet pouch that she kept hidden inside her clothing during the day and under her pillow at night. She touched it compulsively, pressing her fingers against the fabric through her dress, checking that it was still there the way a soldier checks for a weapon. She never opened it in front of anyone. When Jonah, with his characteristic bluntness, once asked her directly what was in the pouch, Clara's face went white so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug, and she changed the subject with a speed that startled even him. Nobody pressed the matter, but the pouch and its contents sat in the back of everyone's mind, a small mystery waiting to be solved. On a quiet afternoon when the brothers were all away, Clara went up to the attic looking for extra blankets. The attic of Hawk's Hollow was a long, low space under the pine-shake roof, cold and dusty, and filled with the accumulated possessions of a household that had once expected to grow. Clara found the blankets quickly enough, but she also found something else: a cradle. It was handmade. The wood had been sanded so smooth it felt like river stone under her fingertips. The headboard was carved with wildflowers, each one rendered with the same meticulous precision she recognized from Elijah's leatherwork. And she understood that these flowers had been carved by the same hands, hands that could shape beauty out of raw material with a patience that bordered on devotion. Inside the cradle, folded with care, that had survived 3 years of attic darkness, lay a tiny white blanket and a small knitted cap. Clara sank to her knees beside the cradle. She pressed her palm flat against the carved wildflowers and held it there. And she understood with a sudden wrenching clarity that seized her chest like a fist exactly what this object represented. It had been built with love and hope, and the particular joy of a man preparing for a child. It had been carried up to this attic by a man who could not bear to see it empty in the nursery where it was supposed to stand. And it had been sitting here in the dark for 3 years, waiting for a life that would never fill it. She cried, silently, the tears falling without sound, because she had learned long ago that the deepest grief made no noise at all. She cried for the baby named Hope. She cried for Sarah, who never got to watch her daughter grow up. She cried for Elijah, who had built this perfect, beautiful thing, and then had to carry it up a ladder and leave it in the dark. And she cried for herself a little because she understood loss and she understood what it meant to carry something precious that the world had taken away. She did not tell Elijah she had found the cradle, but that evening her manner toward him was different, gentler, softer, as if she were handling something precious and fragile that might break if she moved too quickly. Elijah noticed the change but could not identify its source, and when he caught Clara watching him across the dinner table with an expression that held something far deeper than casual concern, he looked away first. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, the relative peace of Elk Ridge was shattered like thin ice under a boot heel. A well-dressed man arrived on the afternoon stage, accompanied by two others. The well-dressed man introduced himself to Sheriff Harlan Tucker as Victor Caldwell of Boston, Massachusetts. He was in his middle 40s, silver at the temples, impeccably groomed, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being obeyed. His companions were a different breed entirely. Fletcher was lean, quiet, and watchful with the economy of movement that marked a man who was professionally dangerous. Greer was larger, rougher, and already scanning the saloon for the bar before his boots hit the ground. Victor Caldwell told Tucker a story. His voice was measured, reasonable, touched with just the right amount of wounded dignity. He was looking for a young woman named Clara Whitfield, a former employee who had absconded with a valuable diamond brooch belonging to his wife Harriet. He had a warrant for her arrest issued by a territorial judge in Helena. He produced the document. It looked official. It looked real. He spread it on Tucker's desk and smoothed the creases with manicured fingers, and his eyes held the calm, patient expression of a man who was accustomed to the law working in his favor. Tucker examined the warrant, examined the man, and filed both observations away without revealing either. The news swept through Elk Ridge like a grass fire. Within hours, the town had divided along a line that nobody could see, but everybody could feel. Victor Caldwell was smooth, articulate, and persuasive. He held court at the saloon, buying rounds of drinks and telling his story with the polished cadence of a man who had given many presentations to many audiences. His poor wife devastated by the betrayal of a trusted servant. Himself merely a dutiful husband seeking to recover stolen property and see justice done. Garrett, the saloon owner who had never particularly liked the Hawk brothers or their self-sufficient ways, became Victor's most vocal supporter. The blacksmith's wife, a woman named Mrs. Keller, who had competed unsuccessfully with Clara for the teaching position, added her voice to the chorus. The faction grew. Whispers followed Clara through the streets. Women who had smiled at her the previous week now crossed to the other side of the road when they saw her coming. But the opposing faction held firm. Ruth Gallagher, who trusted her own judgment of character, the way she trusted her shotgun, which was to say absolutely and without reservation, refused to entertain a word of it. I have been reading people across that counter for 20 years. She told anyone who asked and several people who did not. That girl is no thief. Doc Crane was even more direct. I have looked into that man's eyes, she said of Victor Caldwell, speaking to Tucker in the privacy of his office. He is not here for justice. He is here for possession. There is a difference, Harlan, and you know it. Clara bore the division with a dignity that cost her more than anyone knew. She continued going to work at the store, continued teaching at the school, continued walking through town with her chin lifted and her back straight, even as the whispers followed her like flies. But Caleb, who knew her well enough by now to read the small signs, could see what it was doing to her. The way her hands trembled when she thought nobody was watching. The way her smile had become something she put on rather than something that happened naturally. The way she flinched just slightly every time a door opened behind her, the specific moment that cracked something in Jonah Hawk happened on a Tuesday. Clara was walking to the school. 3 women she had considered friends, women she had helped in the store, women whose children she taught, saw her coming and crossed to the other side of the street without a word, without even the courtesy of a nod. They simply turned away as if she had become invisible and walked on. Clara stopped in the middle of the road. She stood there watching them go, and the expression on her face was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was weariness, a deep bone-level exhaustion with being judged by people who did not know her story, who had heard one side and decided it was enough. She stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on her books, and continued walking to the school. Jonah watched the entire scene from the doorway of the trading post. He said nothing to Clara. He said nothing to anyone. But that evening, when Clara came to the kitchen to start dinner, there was a new carving on the table, a small wooden horse head held high standing alone. She picked it up and held it, and her eyes filled, and she pressed it against her heart. Victor Caldwell made his move on a gray afternoon when the clouds hung low enough to scrape the mountaintops. Clara was leaving Ruth's store when she found Fletcher and Greer positioned on either side of the doorway like sentinels. Behind them, Victor stepped out of the shadows with the precise timing of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "Miss Whitfield." His voice was quiet, reasonable, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I have been patient. I have given you every opportunity to resolve this quietly. People who care about me for who I am, not for what they want to take." She turned and walked back into the store. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the door handle. Ruth met her inside with a cup of tea, a chair, and a loaded 12-gauge behind the counter, because Ruth Gallagher believed in comfort and preparedness in equal measure. That evening, Caleb brought Clara's account of the confrontation back to Hawks Hollow. He also brought information he had gathered through his network of contacts in town. The territorial judge who had issued Victor's warrant was under investigation for accepting bribes. The warrant was almost certainly fraudulent, purchased rather than earned. And Fletcher, the quiet, dangerous one, had been seen doing something that made the hairs on the back of Caleb's neck stand up. He had been walking the perimeter of Elk Ridge, studying the roads in and out, sketching in a small notebook. Elijah listened to all of this in the workshop doorway, his face unreadable. When Caleb finished, Elijah asked one question. "What does this man really want?" Caleb told him what Clara had said. That Victor Caldwell was not a man seeking justice. He was a man who did not accept refusal, a man who viewed Clara as property that had escaped and who would use any means available, legal, financial, or physical, to reclaim her. Something changed in Elijah's eyes. The flatness that had lived there for 3 years shifted. Behind the grief, behind the carefully maintained emptiness, something older and harder surfaced. A look that Caleb had not seen since before Sarah died. The look of a man whose protective instincts had just been engaged fully and irrevocably, and who was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. "He is not taking her," Elijah said quietly. Caleb noted that his brother did not say he is not taking her back. He said he is not taking her. The distinction was significant. Then the mountain intervened the way mountains do, without warning and without mercy. Jonah rode in from the high country at dawn on a Thursday, pushing his horse harder than Caleb had ever seen him push an animal, and the expression on his face was one that both brothers recognized instantly. It was the expression Jonah wore when nature was about to try to kill them. "Storm coming," Jonah said, swinging out of the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. "The worst I have ever seen. We have hours, not days." He knew because he read signs that most men could not see. The clouds stacking in the northwest 2 shades darker than normal. The wind that had shifted direction 3 times in 1 hour. The elk herd moving downhill faster than they should. The metallic taste in the air that preceded the worst blizzards. A lifetime on this mountain had taught him things that no book contained. What followed was controlled chaos, and the narration dwells on it. Because this was the kind of work that defined frontier life, the kind of work that separated those who survived from those who did not. Elijah took command with the natural authority of a man born to lead in crisis. His orders were short and precise. "Caleb, push every head of cattle you can find toward the lower shelter. Jonah, check the barn roof, seal every gap, stack extra straw inside. I will handle firewood and water." Clara appeared on the porch in her wool dress and heavy coat, her hair tied back, her face set with determination. "What can I do?" Elijah looked at her. For a moment, he almost told her to stay inside. Then he saw her jaw, the set of it, the way her chin lifted, the way it had that first day on the street, and he made a decision that surprised him. "Water," he said. "We need every container in the house filled before the creek freezes solid. The buckets are in the shed." Clara hauled water. 12 trips from Elk Creek to the kitchen. Each bucket weighing more than she expected, the handle cutting into her palms, the cold biting through her gloves. By the 6th trip, her hands were raw. By the 10th, they were bleeding at the base of her fingers where the skin had split. She did not stop. She did not complain. She filled every pot, every bucket, every basin in the house, and when she finished, she went looking for more containers. Jonah saw her from the barn. He watched her carry the last bucket with both hands, her small body leaning against the white blood visible on the handle, where her palms had cracked, and something in his face changed in a way that did not change back. He said nothing. But from that moment forward, when he referred to Clara in conversation with his brothers, he used her name. The problem that turned a difficult situation into a dangerous one was the fence. A section of split rail on the far pasture had come down, and 12 head of cattle had scattered toward the high ridge. Losing 12 head in a blizzard was not just a hardship. It was a financial blow that could take years to recover from nearly a fifth of the herd. Elijah and Jonah rode out to bring them back. Caleb stayed at the ranch with Clara. They found the cattle and began driving them downhill, but the storm arrived faster than even Jonah had predicted. The world turned white. Visibility dropped to the length of a horse. The temperature fell with a speed that was almost audible, a physical sensation of the air hardening around them. Jonah, who was lower on the ridge, managed to push most of the cattle toward the ranch. But Elijah, who had ridden higher to retrieve two stragglers that had found a sheltered draw and refused to move, was cut off when the full force of the blizzard struck the mountain like a fist. He could not make it back. But he knew this mountain the way he knew the grain of leather under his hands. Half a mile above him, on a shelf of rock, protected from the worst of the wind, sat one of the line cabins. A small one-room structure 12 feet across with a stove, a cot, and enough supplies to keep a man alive for a week. Elijah reached it. He got his horse into the lean-to-shelter on the lee side. He barricaded the door and built a fire in the stove, and he sat in the small circle of warmth while the mountain tried to tear the cabin apart around him. At Hawk's Hollow, the blizzard screamed. Clara stood at the window watching the white wall of snow and wind erase the world, and her face held an expression that Caleb, watching her from across the room, recognized because he was wearing it himself. Terror. The specific terror of knowing that someone you cared about was somewhere out in that. "He knows the mountain," Caleb said, and his voice was steady in a way that his hands were not. "He will have made for the line cabin." "And if he did not make it?" Clara whispered. The question hung in the room. Caleb did not answer because the only honest answer was not one that either of them could bear to hear. Jonah was pacing, back and forth across the main room, his boots tracking mud and snowmelt, his body vibrating with the frustrated energy of a man whose every instinct screamed at him to act while his mind told him that action meant death. Riding into that storm was suicide. He knew it. He paced anyway. The storm lasted a full day and night. When the wind finally dropped and the snow eased from blinding to merely heavy, Jonah was saddled and mounted before the last gust died. Clara was right behind him, wearing every piece of warm clothing she owned, her face raw from cold but her eyes absolutely steady. "I am coming," she said. Jonah looked at her. This tiny woman from Boston who weighed less than his saddle, who had split her hands open, hauling water, who had no business riding into post-blizzard mountains on a horse she could barely control. He looked at her eyes and saw something he recognized because it was the same thing he saw in the mirror. The absolute refusal to sit safely while someone she loved was in danger. He did not argue. He gave her a single sharp nod, a gesture that carried more weight than any speech, and they rode out together into the white silence of the aftermath. They found Elijah in the line cabin, alive and unhurt, but marked by the experience in ways that were not visible. The cabin sat on the same trail he had ridden 3 years ago, the night he went for Doc Crane, the night the blizzard came and Sarah bled, and he did not make it back in time. He had spent 20 hours in this small room, listening to a storm that sounded exactly like the one that had killed his wife on the same mountain on the same trail, and the ghosts had found him. When Clara pushed through the cabin door, snow-covered and shaking, the look on Elijah's face was one of naked, unguarded relief that he could not mask quickly enough. For one unprotected second before his defenses slammed back into place, his face showed everything. The fear, the gratitude, and something else, something that looked very much like the expression of a man seeing the one person in the world he most needed to see. "You should not have come," he said roughly. "You should not have been out here alone," Clara replied. Jonah, who had witnessed the exchange, looked at Clara for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the ranch to tell Caleb that Elijah was alive. He did not explain why he was leaving them alone. He did not need to. Some things did not require words. The trail conditions meant Clara and Elijah would need to spend the night in the cabin before it was safe to return. They were alone together for the first time, truly alone, in a space so small that emotional distance was physically impossible. The evening began with work. Elijah fed the stove. Clara found supplies and made a simple meal. They dried their wet outer clothes near the heat. Practical tasks, familiar rhythms, the kind of doing that kept hands busy and minds occupied. But as the hours stretched and the wind moaned outside and the fire threw shadows on the log walls, the silence between them changed. It deepened. It gained weight. Elijah sat near the stove, working on a length of bridle leather that had snapped during the ride. His hands moved with automatic precision, the muscle memory of 20 years guiding the needle and thread. Clara sat opposite him, mending a tear in her coat sleeve. They worked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of wind and the small rhythmic sounds of two people repairing things that were broken. Then Elijah's hands began to shake. Not much, just enough to make the needle miss the hole. He looked down at his own hands with an expression of quiet fury, the expression of a man whose body had betrayed him, and Clara saw it. She set down her mending. She reached across the narrow space between them and placed her hand over his. Her hand was small. It covered perhaps a third of his massive calloused palm. She did not squeeze. She did not pat. She simply placed her hand there and held it still the way you might steady a frightened animal with presence rather than force. Elijah stared at her hand on his. He did not pull away. He did not speak. Outside the cabin, the wind found a gap in the logs and made a sound that was almost human. A low moan that rose and fell like breathing, and it sounded exactly like the wind had sounded the night Sarah died. The same mountain, the same trail, the same sound. Sarah died on this trail, Elijah said. He was not looking at Clara. He was looking at the door, at the darkness beyond it, at the years between then and now. Not here, but on this trail. The night the baby came, I rode out for Doc Crane. The storm hit while I was on the ridge. I could not get through. By the time I got back, it was. He stopped, swallowed. His jaw worked. 4 hours. The baby lived 4 hours, long enough for Sarah to hold her, long enough to give her a name. Hope. The word fell into the silence of the cabin like a stone into still water. Hope is a beautiful name, Clara said. That was all she said. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say it would be all right. She did not try to find words for something that words could not hold. She said the name was beautiful, and she kept her hand on his, and she waited. Elijah drew a breath. It came from deep in his chest, and it shuddered on the way out, a long, trembling exhalation that sounded like something breaking free. Not a sob, not a cry. Something quieter and more fundamental than that. The sound of a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years, finally letting it go. His hand turned under hers. His fingers closed around her palm. He held on, and they sat there in the firelight in the small cabin on the mountain while the wind grieved outside, and they did not need to say anything else because some things were too large for language and could only be held in silence together by two people who understood what it meant to carry the weight of the dead. They fell asleep on the narrow cot, sitting up Clara's head against Elijah's shoulder, his arm around her, her hand still in his. Not as lovers, as two people who had found against all odds and against both their wills someone who understood. When morning came, they rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Warmer, less empty. The silence of two people who had shared something that could not be taken back. The weeks that followed were torture for Elijah because the dam that had broken in the cabin did not rebuild. He was awake now, painfully, exquisitely, miserably awake. He noticed everything about Clara, the way she hummed while she cooked, the way she tripped on the same stair every morning and laughed every time, the way Penelope rode on her shoulder while she cleaned, offering editorial commentary in language that was slowly, grudgingly improving, the way her eyes caught the firelight, the way she had, without trying, made his house feel like a home again. He was falling in love with her. The realization sat in his chest like a swallowed coal burning in both directions. Because loving Clara meant betraying Sarah. It meant admitting that his heart had not died with his wife. And if he loved Clara, he could lose Clara, and the math of that was simple, and devastating love equaled loss. It was the only equation his grief understood. He retreated. He pulled back into his workshop. He became cold and distant again, eating quickly and leaving, avoiding the main room, avoiding Clara's eyes. She noticed immediately. She gave him space. but the hurt that flickered across her face each time he withdrew cut him more deeply than he would have admitted to any living soul. Then Caleb brought him the map. Fletcher Victor's professional had been busy. He had sketched a detailed diagram of Hawks Hollow on a piece of paper that Greer had drunkenly dropped at the saloon. The diagram showed the position of every door, every window, the barn, the workshop, the line of sight from the tree line, and in small, precise handwriting, the notation, CW bedroom, second floor, second window from left. Elijah looked at the map. He looked at his brother, and the last wall inside him fell, not slowly, not gradually. It came down all at once like a rotten fence in a high wind, and what stood behind it was not the grieving widower or the wounded recluse. It was the man who had built this ranch with his hands and raised two brothers and survived everything the frontier had thrown at him. The man whose instinct to protect was older than his grief and stronger than his fear. "He is not taking her," Elijah said, and this time the words had the weight of a vow. But Clara had seen the map too. She had found it. She had held it in her trembling hands and read Fletcher's neat notation of her bedroom window, and she had understood with terrible clarity what it meant. The Hawk brothers were in danger. Their home was being watched. Their routines were being cataloged. And all of it, every bit of it, was because of her. She made her decision the way she made all her decisions, quietly alone, and with a selflessness that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. She left in the night. No goodbyes, no explanation. One trunk, the lightest one. She left Penelope in her cage with extra food and water because she could not carry a bird cage through knee-deep snow, and because the bird deserved a warm home, even if Clara could not have one. She slipped out the back door while the house slept and walked into the darkness, heading for the main road, intending to reach the stage route and disappear westward. Anywhere. As long as it was away from these people she had come to love and could not bear to see harmed because of her. Elijah woke at dawn. The house was wrong. He could not explain how he knew. It was a feeling, an absence, a quality to the silence that was different from the ordinary silence of a sleeping house. He went to Clara's room. The door was open. The bed was made. Her trunk was gone. Her clothes were gone. On the pillow, folded once a piece of paper. He picked it up. His hands, the hands that could stitch leather with micrometer precision, were shaking. "I will not let him hurt you because of me. Please take care of Penelope. She likes to be read to in the evenings. Thank you for everything, especially the laughter." It was signed simply, Clara. Elijah stood in the empty room holding the note. Caleb arrived behind him, saw the empty bed, the missing trunk, and understood instantly. He watched his brother's face and saw something he had been waiting 3 years to see, the expression of a man who had just been forced to confront what he stood to lose. "She is gone," Elijah said. "I can see that." Elijah turned to his brother. There were tears in his amber eyes. Not the tears of grief that Caleb knew so well. These were different. These were the tears of a man waking up. "I love her, Caleb." "I know," Caleb said softly. "I have been so afraid of losing someone again that I pushed away the only person who made me want to be alive. I let her walk into a blizzard once and sat in a cabin doing nothing while she came to find me. I will not make that mistake again." He was already pulling on his coat, already reaching for his hat, already moving toward the door with the deliberate, unstoppable momentum of a man who had made a decision and would not be deterred by anything short of divine intervention. Jonah appeared in the hallway. His coat was on. His rifle was in his hand. His green hazel eyes held an expression that Elijah had not seen since before Sarah died: readiness. Purpose. The fierce, focused look of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. He did not speak. He did not need to. The look he gave Elijah said everything. "Let us go get her." 3 brothers rode out into the mountain morning side by side, their breath fogging in the cold air, their horses' hooves breaking through the crust of last night's frost. For the first time in 3 years, the Hawk brothers moved together with a common purpose, and that purpose was not grief, not survival, not the mechanical continuation of a life that had lost its meaning. It was hope, desperate, fragile, ferocious hope. The hope that they could find one small, clumsy, spectacularly brave woman before the mountains swallowed her, or before Victor Caldwell and his hired men figured out she was alone on an empty road with nothing but a trunk and a courage that was large enough to break your heart. Elijah rode in front. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear. And somewhere behind the pain and the fear and the 3 years of practiced emptiness, something was burning. Something that felt for the first time since a frozen night in 1875 like being alive. They found her tracks within the first mile. Clara Whitfield was many things. She was educated, quick-witted, kind-hearted, and possessed of a stubborn courage that would have impressed a mule. But she was not a frontiersman. Her footprints in the snow told the story of her escape with the blunt honesty of a trail that did not know how to lie. She had left through the back door and headed south toward the main road, dragging her trunk behind her, cutting a furrow through the snowpack that was visible from 100 yards. She had not zigzagged or doubled back or done any of the things that a person familiar with tracking might do to obscure their path. She had simply walked in a straight line through knee-deep snow in the dark alone. Jonah read the trail the way other men read newspapers. His eyes moved across the snow with the focused intensity of a man whose survival had depended on this skill since childhood, and what the trail told him made it his jaw tighten. "She is slowing down," he said, pointing to where the distance between footprints had shortened. "Started strong, got tired around here." He indicated a place where the trunk had been set down, 2 flat impressions in the snow where Clara had rested. Picked it up again, kept going. Further on, a longer pause. The trunk impressions deeper, boot prints closer together. Getting cold. Her stride is shortening. Then 2 miles from the ranch, the trail told a story that made Caleb swear under his breath and Elijah dig his heels into his horse's flanks. The footprints became erratic, staggering, and then they stopped at a place where the snow was compressed in the shape of a body. Clara had fallen. The impression showed where she had lain on her side in the snow for what looked from the depth of the compression like a long time. Too long. Then somehow she had gotten up again. The trunk furrow resumed. The footprints continued. Smaller steps now, weaving slightly. "She got back up," Jonah said. There was something in his voice that had not been there before. Not admiration exactly. Recognition. The recognition of one stubborn creature, it acknowledging another. Half frozen, exhausted, alone in the dark. And she got back up. Elijah said nothing. He rode faster. They found Clara at the junction where the ranch trail met the main road to Elk Ridge, 5 miles from Hawks Hollow. She was sitting on her trunk in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, her face raw and red, her honey blonde hair tangled with frost, her body shaking with the deep involuntary tremors of someone whose core temperature had dropped to a dangerous level. She had been walking for more than 4 hours, through conditions that would have challenged a man twice her size, and she had made it 5 miles, which was remarkable, and she had approximately 20 more to go before reaching the nearest stage stop, which was impossible, and some part of her had clearly understood this because she had stopped moving and sat down. She was crying. Not the delicate, controlled tears she had shed in the house. Hard, ugly, exhausted tears, the kind that come when the body is too depleted for dignity and the only thing left is the raw animal fact of despair. Her gloves were dark with blood from her split palms. Her lips were blue. She looked, Elijah thought, as he dismounted, like the loneliest person he had ever seen in his life. When she heard the hooves and looked up and saw 3 riders coming toward her through the morning light, her face did something that Elijah would remember until the day he died. It collapsed. All the composure, all the bravery, all the steel that had kept her moving through 5 miles of frozen darkness simply gave way. She put her face in her bloody hands and wept with the full, shattered abandon of a woman who had tried to be strong enough and had discovered that she was not. And that discovery was both her greatest defeat and, though she did not know it yet, the beginning of everything. She tried to stand. She managed it for approximately 2 seconds before her boot caught the corner of the trunk. She stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again, and sat back down in the snow with a graceless thump that sent up a small white explosion around her. Even now, even sitting in the snow, defeated and frozen and crying, she could not cross 5 feet of flat ground without tripping over something. The absurdity of it, the perfect, terrible, heartbreaking absurdity, hit Elijah somewhere behind his ribs. He dismounted and walked to her through the snow. He did not hurry. He moved with the deliberate, steady pace of a man who wanted her to see him coming, who wanted her to know that he was choosing this, that every step toward her was intentional. He knelt in front of her, in the snow, so they were eye to eye. "Come home," he said. Clara shook her head. Tears and snot and frost on her face, no dignity left, nothing between her and the cold world, but a thin coat and a stubbornness that had carried her 5 miles and could not carry her one step further. I cannot. Victor will hurt you. He will hurt Caleb and Jonah. He will burn that ranch. I have seen what he does to people who stand in his way, and I will not. I cannot let that happen because of me. Victor Caldwell will go through me and my brothers and every decent man in Elk Ridge before he touches you, Elijah said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of bedrock, the kind of certainty that came not from bravado, but from a man who had weighed the cost and accepted it. And if he manages all that, he will still have to deal with Penelope. Clara made a sound, half laugh, half sob, a broken, desperate, beautiful sound that was the most human thing Elijah had heard in 3 years. That is not funny. I know it is not, but you almost smiled, and I have recently discovered that I will say almost anything to make that happen. He paused, held her eyes, let her see what was in his. Come home, Clara, please. She searched his face, looking for what he did not know. Certainty, maybe, sincerity. The answer to a question she was afraid to ask out loud. Whatever she found there, it was enough, she nodded, once. A small, exhausted dip of her chin. Elijah lifted her off the trunk and onto his horse, as if she weighed nothing, then mounted behind her and wrapped his coat around them both. She leaned back against his chest, and he felt her trembling ease as his body heat began to reach her through the layers. Her head rested against his shoulder. Her eyes closed. Behind them, Caleb was grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. Jonah was not grinning, but the hard line of his mouth had softened into something that, on Jonah Hawk, qualified as practically jubilant. They brought Clara's trunk home. They brought Clara home. And the house which had felt wrong at dawn felt right again by noon. And if Elijah noticed the difference, he did not comment on it, because commenting on it would mean acknowledging what the house had become to him and what Clara had become to him, and he was not quite ready for that yet. But he was getting closer. Hour by hour, he was getting closer. The reckoning with Victor Caldwell came 2 days later, and it came the way such things come in frontier towns, publicly, decisively, and with the whole community watching. Victor had grown desperate. The careful, patient predator who had arrived in Elk Ridge with manicured fingers and a fraudulent warrant had been deteriorating for weeks. His money was running low. His legal strategy was crumbling. The townspeople who had initially believed his story were peeling away, as Clara's character, demonstrated through months of honest work and genuine kindness, proved more convincing than Victor's polished performance. Fletcher the professional had begun exhibiting the restless dissatisfaction of a hired man who sensed that the job was going sideways. Greer had been drunk more often than sober for the past 10 days. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon outside Ruth Gallagher's general store. Greer, operating on whiskey courage and employer's orders, approached Clara as she was leaving with a basket of supplies. He seized her arm with enough force to leave bruises and pulled her toward him. Mr. Caldwell wants a word, Greer said. His breath smelled like rot and bourbon, and he is done asking nicely. Greer did not finish the sentence. Jonah Hawk materialized from the doorway of the trading post with the silent, frictionless speed of a predator closing distance. He covered 10 feet in the time it took Greer to blink. His hand closed around Greer's wrist and twisted with a precise, practiced motion that spoke of experience, efficiency, and a complete indifference to whether the bones inside the wrist remained intact. Greer released Clara with a howl that brought people running from buildings up and down the street. Jonah did not let go. He held the twisted wrist and leaned close, and his green hazel eyes were flat calm and utterly devoid of anything that resembled mercy. Touch her again, Jonah said, his voice no louder than a man discussing the weather, and I will track you into those mountains and leave you there. Nobody will find you until spring, and maybe not even then. Greer, who had spent a career intimidating shopkeepers and debtors and people who could not fight back, looked into Jonah Hawk's eyes and saw something that evaporated his professional courage like water on a hot stove. He stumbled backward when Jonah released him, cradling his wrist, and retreated toward the saloon without another word. Clara was shaking but unhurt. She touched Jonah's arm. Thank you. Jonah looked at her, and something passed between them that needed no words. A recognition, an acceptance, the final closing of a distance that had been shrinking for months. "Stop walking around town without one of us," he said. "You are terrible at looking after yourself." "I am," Clara agreed, and her smile was thin but real. The confrontation escalated from there with the speed and inevitability of a rockslide. Victor stormed from the saloon, his composure cracking visibly, and planted himself in the middle of the main street, demanding that Sheriff Tucker enforce his warrant and arrest Clara Whitfield immediately. His voice had lost its measured, reasonable tone. It had the ragged edge of a man who was watching his control slip away and could not stop it. The crowd that gathered was nearly the entire population of Elk Ridge. Word had spread through the town with the speed that only small communities achieve, and people emerged from every building, every house, every workshop within earshot. They lined the boardwalks and filled the doorways and stood in the muddy street, and they watched because this was the kind of moment that defined a town, and everyone knew it. The Hawk brothers stood together, Elijah in the center, Caleb on his left, Jonah on his right. Three men each, over 6.5 feet tall, built like the mountains behind them, standing shoulder to shoulder in the street with Clara positioned behind them. It was the first time in 3 years that the three brothers had stood united in public, and the visual impact was considerable. Three walls of resolve and muscle arranged between a frightened woman and the man who had come 2,000 miles to claim her. Sheriff Harlan Tucker walked into the space between the two parties. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he wants everyone watching to understand that what is about to happen carries the full weight of his authority. His right hand rested on the grip of his Colt 1860 Army, not because he intended to draw it, but because the gesture communicated something that words could not. "I have looked into this matter thoroughly," Tucker said. His voice was calm, pitched to carry across the crowd, without shouting, the voice of a man who had commanded soldiers at Gettysburg, and who understood that true authority did not require volume. "I have exchanged telegrams with authorities in Helena and with colleagues back east. Here is what I have found." Tucker dismantled Victor Caldwell's case the way a skilled carpenter dismantles a poorly built structure, one rotten board at a time. The warrant, issued by a territorial judge currently under investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office for accepting bribes in at least 11 documented cases. The warrant was fraudulent, purchased rather than earned, not worth the paper it was printed on. The brooch. Clara possessed a handwritten letter from Harriet Caldwell herself, obtained through a sympathetic intermediary and authenticated by Tucker's contacts in Boston, confirming that the diamond brooch was a gift given freely and with affection. Not stolen. Given. The motive. Tucker had received statements from 3 witnesses, all patrons of the Elk Ridge Saloon, confirming that Greer, while intoxicated, had made repeated statements indicating that Victor's purpose in Montana had nothing to do with recovering property. His exact words, Tucker said, consulting a small notebook, were, and I quote, "The boss and his obsessions. This is not about any damn brooch." "Mr. Caldwell," Tucker said, and his gaze settled on Victor like a weight. "Your warrant is fraudulent. Your charges are false. Your hired man has assaulted a woman on my street. And your conduct in my town has been, to use the most generous term available to me, reprehensible." He closed the notebook. "You have 24 hours to leave Elk Ridge. If you are still within the limits of this town when the sun comes up tomorrow, I will arrest you for filing false charges, intimidation, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of her liberty. Do I make myself clear?" The mask broke. Victor Caldwell's carefully constructed facade of respectability, the wounded husband, the dutiful seeker of justice, the reasonable man simply trying to right a wrong, shattered like glass dropped on stone. What emerged was ugly and raw and honest in the worst possible way. His eyes found Clara behind the wall of Hawk brothers, and his face twisted with a hatred so personal, so intimate, that it confirmed everything Tucker had just said without the need for a single additional word. "You think these mountain savages can protect you?" Victor's voice had risen to something that was not quite a shout, but was far from the measured tones he had employed on arrival. "You are nothing, Clara, a servant, a nobody. You were nothing when I found you, and you are nothing now." He did not get to say anything else. Elijah stepped forward. He did not rush, he did not lunge. He moved with the slow, measured, inevitable quality of something geological. A glacier, a landslide, a force that could not be hurried because it could not be stopped. He placed himself between Victor and Clara, and he looked down at the smaller man from a height advantage of nearly a foot. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the people on the edges of the crowd had to lean forward to hear him. "Her name is Clara Whitfield," Elijah said. "She is not nothing. She is the woman who taught a dead man how to live again. And if you speak to her that way one more time, I will forget that I am standing in front of witnesses." The street held its breath. Elijah Hawk and Victor Caldwell, separated by 3 feet and a moral distance that could not be measured in any unit of human reckoning. Victor looked up into Elijah's amber eyes and saw something that made him take an involuntary step backward. Not anger. Anger he could have understood. What he saw was worse than anger. It was the perfect, settled, immovable certainty of a man who had already lost everything he loved and who therefore had nothing left to fear. Fletcher the professional read the situation with the practiced eye of a man whose survival depended on accurate threat assessment. He looked at the 3 Hawk brothers. He looked at Tucker with his hand on the Colt. He looked at Ruth Gallagher, standing in the doorway of her store with a 12-gauge shotgun cradled in her arms like an infant. He looked at the assembled faces of Elk Ridge, and he calculated the odds, and he made the most intelligent decision of his career. He took his hand away from his belt. "I am not being paid enough for this," Fletcher said to Victor with the flat resignation of a man closing a ledger that no longer balanced. "I am out." Greer, nursing his wrist and his pride in roughly equal measure, said nothing but followed Fletcher toward the livery stable with the speed of a man who had been looking for an exit and had just been given one. Victor stood alone in the street. His hired men had abandoned him. The sheriff had exposed him. The town he had tried to manipulate had turned against him. And the woman he had crossed a continent to reclaim stood behind a wall of mountain men and looked at him, not with fear, not with hatred, but with something far worse: pity. Victor Caldwell left Elk Ridge on the morning stage alone, diminished, carrying nothing but his expensive luggage and the remains of a reputation that would not survive the journey back to Boston. Months later, word reached Elk Ridge through Tucker's network of contacts that Harriet Caldwell had filed for divorce, that the details of Victor's conduct had become public, and that the man who had once wielded money and power like weapons had lost both. Justice, it turned out, kept its own schedule. The external threat was gone, but the internal one remained, and it was in many ways more terrifying than Victor Caldwell and his hired men had ever been. On a quiet evening with Caleb conveniently occupied at the trading post and Jonah attending to horses in the barn, with the pointed determination of a man who had been told, without being told, that his presence inside the house was not required, Elijah found Clara in the kitchen. She was stirring something on the stove. She looked up when he entered, and her expression was guarded, careful. The expression of a woman who had learned through painful experience that hope was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly. "Clara, we need to talk." Her face fell. She set down the spoon. Her hands were trembling. "If this is about me finding somewhere else to live, I understand. I have saved enough from working at Ruth's store and the school that I could probably afford a room at the boarding house. The railroad surveyors left last week, so there should be space." "No," Elijah said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. "That is not what I want." "Then what do you want, Elijah?" He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the pulse in her throat, close enough to count the freckles across her nose, close enough to see the hope she was trying to hide behind the caution in her blue eyes. "I have been dead inside for 3 years," he said. "I convinced myself that was all I deserved, that the best I could hope for was to fill the hours with work until the hours ran out. And then you fell off a water trough in front of the whole town and made me laugh, and something broke open in my chest that I have not been able to close." Clara's eyes were shining. She did not speak. "You are clumsy," Elijah continued. The ghost of a smile was pulling at his mouth, pulling against the weight of everything he was trying to say. "You are chaotic. You have a parrot that curses like a sailor. You trip on flat ground and burn dinner at least once a week and somehow got yourself tangled in a clothesline last Tuesday in a way that I still cannot physically explain. And every single day you make me want to wake up in the morning. Every single day you remind me that being alive is supposed to mean something more than just enduring." Elijah, his name in her mouth, barely a whisper. "I love you, Clara. I am terrified of it. The last time I loved someone, I lost her, and it nearly destroyed me. But I am more terrified of spending the rest of my life without you than I am of losing you." Clara was crying, tears tracking down her face, catching the lamplight. But she did not move toward him. She took a step back, and the space she put between them felt to Elijah like a canyon opening in the floor. "I love you too," she said, and the words were full of anguish. "But I will not be a replacement, Elijah. I will not be the woman you settled for because your first wife died and your brother tricked you into meeting me. I need to know that you love me for who I am. Not because I fill the empty space Sarah left. Not because I am convenient. Not because you are lonely." Her voice strengthened. "Me, Clara Whitfield, with all my clumsiness and my ridiculous parrot and my complete inability to walk across a room without breaking something. I need you to be sure. I need you to know the difference." The words landed on Elijah like stones, not because they were cruel, because they were right. She was asking him to do the hardest thing a grieving man could do, to examine his own heart with ruthless honesty and determine whether what he felt was love for Clara or love for the idea of not being empty anymore. He nodded slowly. "You are right. You deserve that certainty. Give me time." "Take all the time you need," Clara said. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her chin was lifted. Her shoulders were straight. And Elijah looked at her, standing there in his kitchen, small and fierce, and unwilling to accept less than she deserved, and he thought that. That is who she is. That is what I love. Not the absence of grief, her. But he needed to be sure. She had asked for certainty, and he owed her nothing less. He spent 3 days in his workshop, not hiding this time, thinking. He worked while he thought because his hands needed occupation, the way his lungs needed air, and the rhythm of stitching leather helped order his mind the way it always had. He examined his feelings with the same precision he brought to his craft, testing each one, the way he tested a seam, checking for weakness, for faults, for places where the material might give. He thought about Sarah, not the idealized Sarah that grief had constructed, the perfect wife preserved in amber, but the real Sarah, the woman who laughed too loudly at her own jokes, who argued with him about fence placement with a stubbornness that rivaled his own, who sang off key while cooking and knew it and did not care, who saw the best in every person she met, including him, especially him, and who had made him believe that the best she saw was actually there. He loved Sarah. He would always love Sarah. That was not in question and never had been. Then he thought about Clara, and he realized with a clarity that arrived not as a thunderbolt, but as a sunrise, slow and warm, and impossible to argue with, that what he loved about Clara was entirely, completely, irreducibly Clara. Not Sarah's echo, not a substitution, not a patch over a wound. Clara. He loved her clumsiness not because it reminded him of anyone, but because it was so fundamentally and absurdly and inescapably her own. He loved her wit, the quick self-deprecating humor that she used not as armor but as a bridge, a way of saying, "I know I am imperfect, and I am going to laugh about it, and you are welcome to laugh with me." He loved her courage, the steel core inside the small frame, the woman who had hauled water until her hands bled and walked 5 miles through snow in the dark, and told Victor Caldwell to his face that she had something he would never have. He loved that she spoke to Sarah's name in the dark with tenderness and respect. He loved that she rode through a blizzard's aftermath to find him. He loved that she left to protect his family, and he loved that she came back. He loved that she demanded to be loved for herself, because that demand told him exactly who she was, a woman who would rather be alone than be a stand-in. Sarah was the love of his youth. Clara was the love of his healing. They were not the same love. They were not interchangeable. They were two separate truths living in the same heart, and recognizing that did not diminish either one. It enlarged him. On the evening of the third day, Elijah put down his tools and walked to the fireplace in the main room. He stood in front of the beam where Sarah's name was carved and looked at the letters he had cut into the wood 3 years ago, with hands that shook from grief and a terror of forgetting. Sarah. He ran his fingers over the letters the way Clara had that first night in the dark. Then he picked up his finest carving tool, and below Sarah's name, he cut a small wildflower into the wood. The same wildflower that decorated the cradle he had built for Hope. The same wildflower that grew on the ridge where Sarah was buried. And beside the flower, in the same careful, precise lettering, he carved one word. Always, Sarah. Always. The name stayed, the love stayed, the past stayed, but the tomb he had built around his heart opened, and Elijah Hawk walked out of it and closed the door behind him and did not look back. Below the wildflower, and always he carved one more name, Clara. He did not carve it in smaller letters. He did not tuck it into a corner. He carved it the same swim, the same depth, the same deliberate precision. Because this was not a hierarchy, it was a testament. Two names on a beam above a fire. Two loves held by one heart. Both real, both permanent, both true. He wrapped the beam in a blanket, pried it from its brackets with a care that bordered on reverence, and carried it to the school. Clara was just finishing her afternoon lesson when Elijah pushed through the schoolhouse door carrying a 6-foot timber on his shoulder. The children stared. Clara stared. Penelope, who Clara brought to the school in her cage because the bird grew despondent when left alone too long, stared with the tilted head curiosity that parrots deploy when assessing whether a situation is edible. Elijah waited until the last child filed out. Then he set the beam on the table in front of Clara and stepped back. Clara looked down. She saw Sarah. She saw the wildflower. She saw always. And below it, fresh in the wood, the letters still pale with newness, Clara. She pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes filled. I did not erase her name, Elijah said. I cannot. I will never. She is part of me, and she always will be. He paused, drew a breath, let it out. But I added yours, not to replace hers, because my heart has room for both. I love Sarah because she was Sarah. I love you because you are you. Two different women, two different loves, both of them real, both of them mine. He looked at her across the table, across the timber that held both their histories, and said the thing he had come to say. Will you have me, Clara? A man with a dead wife's name on his mantle and sawdust in his hair, and a brother who commits mail fraud, and a youngest brother who barely speaks in complete sentences? Will you have all of that, knowing that I come with a past that I will not set down because it made me who I am, and who I am is the man who loves you? Clara opened her mouth to answer. Before she could speak, Penelope, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing agitation, threw back her bright red head and screamed at full volume, "Hallelujah!" The word rang through the empty schoolhouse like a bell. The timing was so perfect, so impossibly cosmically precise, that for a moment neither of them could breathe. Then Clara laughed, and then Elijah laughed, and they stood there in the schoolhouse, laughing together, the sound bouncing off the wooden walls and the small desks and the chalkboard filling the room the way laughter fills a space that has been waiting for it. Is that a yes from the parrot? Elijah asked. That is a yes from me, Clara said. She threw her arms around his neck with enough force to stagger him backward into a desk, which crashed into another desk, which sent a stack of books cascading to the floor, which knocked over the globe, which rolled across the room and came to rest against Penelope's cage. Clara was laughing and crying at the same time, her face pressed against his chest, her arms locked around him, holding on with a fierceness that suggested she intended never to let go. Elijah held her. His arms that could wrestle a steer to the ground and carry 200 pounds of leather without strain, closed around her with a gentleness that was its own kind of strength. He rested his chin on the top of her head. She fit there. She fit exactly there, as if the space had been made for her, which he supposed it had. He kissed her, gently, carefully. The way a man touches something he has been afraid to reach for because reaching meant hoping, and hoping meant risking, and risking meant the possibility of a loss he was not sure he could survive again. But she was here. She was warm and alive and real in his arms, and her lips were soft against his, and when they parted, she looked up at him with those blue eyes and smiled, and the smile broke through the last of his defenses like spring breaking through frozen ground. I love you, Elijah Hawk, she said, even though you are grumpy and you work too much, and you still have not fixed that stair I trip on every morning. I love you, Clara Whitfield, he said, and I am never fixing that stair. Watching you trip on it is the best part of my day. They were married in June when the wildflowers covered the mountain slopes in the same purple and gold they had worn the day Elijah married Sarah 6 years before. Clara chose the location, not the chapel in Elk Ridge, but the ridge above Hawks Hollow, the ridge where Sarah and Hope were buried. She told Elijah she wanted to begin their life together in the presence of the people who had come before because they were part of his story and therefore part of hers, and she would not pretend otherwise. On the morning of the wedding before dawn, Clara walked alone to Sarah's grave. She knelt in the dew-wet grass beside the stone marker and laid a bunch of wildflowers against it, the same flowers carved into the cradle, the same flowers Elijah had carved on the beam. "I promise to take care of him," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, meant for no audience but the dead and the mountain and the sky. "Not the way you would have. I could never be you, and I would not try. But I will make sure he laughs. I will make sure he knows he is loved, and I will tell our children about you, about hope, about the woman who loved him first. You will always be part of this family, Sarah. Always." She did not know that Elijah had followed her, that he stood behind the tree line listening. When she rose and turned and saw him there, the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. Gratitude, love, and something she had given him that he had not known he needed permission to be happy without guilt. Caleb served as best man and delivered a speech that the town talked about for years. "I would just like to point out," he told the assembled guests, "that absolutely none of this would have happened without me. Specifically without my willingness to commit mail fraud across territorial lines on behalf of a brother who was too stubborn to save himself. You are all very welcome." The crowd laughed. Elijah shook his head. Clara threw her bouquet directly at Caleb's face. Jonah stood beside his brothers in a clean shirt that he wore with the visible discomfort of a man being slowly strangled by respectability. His gift to the couple was a wooden box with Clara's initials carved into the lid. Not Elijah's initials, Clara's. Inside were hand-carved animals, horses, cattle, deer, wolves, an elk, a rabbit, and a parrot. Months of work, hundreds of hours, the finest thing his hands had ever made. When Clara opened it, she wept. Jonah muttered that it was just wood and was promptly embraced with enough force to make even his considerable frame stagger. He did not push her away. He stood there with his arms at his sides and his jaw working and his green hazel eyes bright. And after a moment, one large hand came up and rested briefly on the back of Clara's head. Just for a second. Then he stepped back and cleared his throat and found somewhere else to look. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, Penelope unleashed "Anchors Away" at a volume that sent birds fleeing from the surrounding pines and caused Sheriff Tucker to put his hand on his sidearm out of reflex. The entire assembly dissolved into laughter, and the laughter carried across the valley and echoed off the mountains, and somewhere in that sound was the distilled essence of everything the day meant: joy reclaimed from grief, love rebuilt from loss, and a community celebrating one of its own. Elijah laughed loudest of all. The years that followed were full and noisy and rich with the particular chaos that Clara Whitfield brought to everything she touched. Clara took over the business side of the saddle shop and discovered that Elijah had been undercharging for his work by a margin that made her governess' trained accounting instincts physically ache. She adjusted prices. She organized records. She expanded into custom leather goods. The business thrived in ways it never had because Elijah was a master craftsman and Clara was a natural manager, and together they were something neither could have been alone. Elijah taught Clara to ride. She fell off 11 times. Caleb kept a tally on a board at the trading post that became something of a local attraction, and there was briefly a betting pool on whether she would reach 15 before achieving competence. She did not reach 15. She mastered the horse on the 12th attempt through sheer bloody-minded determination, and the sight of her riding alongside Elijah through the mountain trails, tiny next to his massive frame, became one of Elk Ridge's most familiar and most beloved images. Her clumsiness remained undiminished by matrimony. She knocked over the Christmas tree on its first evening in the house. She dropped an entire pie face down on the kitchen floor while trying to impress Doc Crane. She walked into the screen door on the front porch so frequently that Elijah eventually removed it, declaring it a greater hazard to public safety than the wolf pack. She got her hair tangled in the butter churn. She tripped over Penelope's cage over the cat that had migrated indoors through feline persistence, over her own feet on a daily basis that bordered on the mathematical. Elijah caught her every time, or helped her up, or cleaned up the broken pieces, or simply laughed the deep, full, genuine laugh that had been absent from his life for 3 years and that now filled the house on a daily basis because Clara Whitfield Hawk was a one-woman natural disaster, and Elijah had discovered to his considerable surprise that natural disasters were exactly what he needed. Caleb became Penelope's favorite person, a distinction he accepted with unjustified pride. The parrot rode on his shoulder during business hours at the trading post and learned to say fair price and no credit on command, which Caleb considered the apex of avian commercial training. Jonah changed the most. He still disappeared into the mountains for days at a time. He still communicated primarily through silences, grunts, and the occasional complete sentence. But he came home more often. He ate dinner with the family. He carved gifts with increasing skill and tenderness. And when Clara announced in the spring of 1880 that she was expecting a baby, Jonah was the first person to the barn to begin building shelves for a nursery, and the expression on his face when he thought nobody was watching was one of such naked, unguarded happiness that Clara, who saw it through the window, had to sit down because her eyes were too blurred to stand. The pregnancy terrified Elijah. The old fear came back cold and absolute, and for weeks he could barely look at Clara without seeing Sarah's face white and still the blood that would not stop. He hovered. He worried. He forbade her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup, which she tolerated with patient amusement for approximately 3 days before informing him that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and that if he did not stop following her from room to room, she was going to lock him in his workshop. Doc Crane managed the pregnancy with professional calm and personal investment. She was present this time. She was prepared. And when Clara went into labor on a cool October evening, Doc Crane was at her side within the hour, and the delivery, while not easy, was not the catastrophe that Elijah's fears had predicted. Caleb physically restrained Elijah from breaking down the bedroom door during the hardest hours. Jonah sat on the front porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the sunrise, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. The baby arrived at dawn, a boy, healthy, strong, with a cry that echoed through Hawk's Hollow and announced to the valley that a new voice had joined the chorus. They named him Henry Samuel Hawk, Henry for Clara's father, Samuel for Caleb, whose middle name it was honoring the brother whose misguided love had brought them all to this moment. When Caleb heard the name, he sat down on the porch steps and put his face in his hands and cried, and Jonah pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing Jonah knew how to do. Elijah held his son for the first time with hands that trembled. The baby was small and red and perfect, and his eyes, when he opened them, were the same clear blue as his mother's. Elijah looked at that tiny face and thought of Hope, who had lived 4 hours, who had been small and perfect too, who had opened her eyes in this same house on a night that smelled of blood and snow and endings. He held Henry against his chest and sent a silent promise skyward to Sarah, to Hope. To whatever force governed the terrible mathematics of love and loss, I will love this one enough for both. A daughter followed 2 years later. They named her Sarah Rose, and the name was Elijah's suggestion offered one evening as they sat by the fire, and Clara's acceptance was immediate, wholehearted, and accompanied by tears that she did not try to hide. The name was not a ghost. It was a bridge. It connected the woman Elijah loved first with the family he had built, with the woman he loved now, and it sat on the mantel beam alongside all the other names carved in the same hand, at the same depth, with the same permanence. Sarah, always. Clara, Henry, Sarah Rose. The beam held them all. Sarah Rose grew up graceful and serious and sharp with numbers, the only member of the household who could cross a room without colliding with the furniture. Henry inherited his mother's clumsiness and his father's determination, a combination that kept his parents in a state of loving, exhausted vigilance. Caleb never married. He claimed to be too busy being the greatest uncle in Montana Territory, and he was by all available evidence correct. Jonah found his peace not through marriage, but through purpose. He became a renowned tracker and guide, leading expeditions through mountains he knew better than his own reflection. Between trips, he returned to Hawk's Hollow, where the children treated him with a mixture of awe and delight that he pretended to find irritating and secretly treasured more than anything he owned. On a summer evening, years after the wedding, the family gathered at Hawk's Hollow. The house was full. Every room held noise and warmth, and the smell of food and the sound of children arguing, and Penelope offering commentary that had over the years improved in vocabulary, if not in volume. The bird had learned "eat your greens" and bedtime, and inexplicably still bellowed "hallelujah" at random intervals, usually at the worst possible moment, which meant in the Hawk household, the best possible moment. After dinner, when the children were chasing each other through the yard, and Caleb was teaching Henry to whittle, while Jonah stood guard to ensure all fingers remained attached, Elijah found Clara at the window. She was watching the sunset turn the mountains to gold and rose, and the light caught her hair, and she was beautiful. Not the blank, perfect beauty of a painting, the warm, lived-in beauty of a woman who had built a life from nothing and wore every year of it with grace. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking?" "About how different everything could have been," Clara said, leaning into him. "If I had not answered that advertisement, if I had not gotten on that stage, if you had sent me away." "Do you wish it had been different?" "Well, for one single moment." She turned in his arms and looked up at him, and he saw in her eyes the same thing he had seen that first day on the frozen street, the thing that had terrified him then and sustained him ever since. Hope. Not the frantic, desperate hope of a woman with nowhere else to go. The quiet, certain hope of a woman who had found exactly where she belonged. "I love you, Elijah Hawk," she said, reaching up to touch his face. Her elbow caught the vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. The vase fell. It shattered on the floor. Water and flowers spread across the boards. Clara winced. Elijah laughed. Full and deep and free, the laugh of a man who had forgotten how and been reminded by a woman who could not cross a room without leaving wreckage behind her. "Some things," he said, "never change. Would you want them to? Not for anything in this world." They kissed, standing in the puddle of water and scattered wildflowers, while the sunset burned the sky and the house hummed with life around them. And above the fireplace, the beam held its names. Sarah. Always. Clara, Henry, Sarah, Rose. 5 names carved in wood, 5 lives held in one family's story, a record of loss and love, and the stubborn, magnificent refusal to let grief have the last word. Elijah Hawk stood in the doorway of the home he had built with his own hands and watched his wife trip over the threshold because some things truly never changed. He watched his children play in the mountain grass. He watched his brothers walk toward the house for the evening meal. Caleb already talking, Jonah already silent, both of them exactly as they should be. He was smiling, not the cautious, testing smile of a man checking whether happiness was safe. The full, radiant, unguarded smile of a man who had walked through the darkest valley he knew and come out the other side, not unscathed, not unchanged, but alive. Truly, deeply, gratefully alive. The grieving mountain man had become a happy one. A husband, a father, a brother. A man who had learned that the heart was not a fixed container with a set capacity, but a living thing that grew to hold whatever love was offered to it. A man who had learned that honoring the dead did not require joining them, and that the bravest thing a broken man could do was not to endure the breaking, but to let someone help him heal. And it had all started with a clumsy woman falling off a water trough on a frozen winter morning in Elk Ridge, Montana, in the year 1878. A woman who carried a cursing parrot in a stolen brooch that was not stolen, and enough courage to cross a continent on a promise that turned out to be a lie, and turned out in the end to be the truest thing that had ever happened to either of them, the best accident of his life. And somewhere in whatever quiet place waits beyond the mountains, a woman named Sarah was smiling too, because the man she had loved had finally remembered how to live. And the woman who had taught him was everything Sarah would have chosen for him if choosing had been hers to do. The wildflowers on the ridge bloomed every spring, without fail purple and gold against the green, and the wind carried their scent down to the house where love lived, just as the sign above the kitchen door had always promised.